In my 27 years of police work, I've seen a lot of things, but nothing shook me like that night. That old gas station outside of Millbrook. Even now, when I pass by there, my hair stands on end. If you knew what we experienced there that night, you'd never be able to get gas alone either. My name is Detective Marcus Sullivan, badge number 2847, Millbrook County Sheriff's Department. What I'm about to tell you happened on October 23, 2022. It was a cold autumn night, the kind that makes you grateful for the heater in your patrol car and makes you dread getting out to investigate anything. I'd been working the graveyard shift for nearly 15 years, covering the rural areas outside Millbrook, Tennessee. It's quiet country out there, farmland, scattered houses, and long stretches of empty highway where your headlights are the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. Most nights, the biggest excitement you get is a drunk driver weaving his way home from Murphy's Tavern, or a domestic disturbance that turns out to be neighbors arguing about a property line. But that night was different. I could feel it in the air, that electric tension that sometimes precedes the kind of calls that change you forever. The radio had been quiet all evening, too quiet for a Saturday night, even in our sleepy corner of Tennessee. It was almost like the county was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. At 11:47 p.m., the silence broke. Unit 23, respond to 2847 Highway 41 South. Abandoned Shell Station. Anonymous caller reports suspicious activity. Possible squatters. Proceed with caution. I knew the location immediately. The old Shell station had been closed for nearly 8 years, ever since the new truck stop opened. Closer to the interstate, it sat on a lonely stretch of Highway 41, surrounded by nothing but pine trees and tobacco fields. The kind of place that attracted teenagers looking for somewhere to drink, beer, and homeless folks seeking shelter from the weather. Unit 23 responding, I radioed back, already turning my patrol car toward Highway 41. ETA, approximately 15 minutes. The drive took me through some of the most isolated country in our jurisdiction. Miles of darkness broken only by the occasional farmhouse light or the red glow of a cell tower beacon. My headlights swept across weathered barns and rusted mailboxes, marking the boundaries of properties where families had worked the same land for generations. As I drove, I tried to imagine what kind of suspicious activity might be happening at an abandoned gas station at midnight. Probably kids having a party, or maybe someone had broken into the building looking for copper wire or old equipment to sell. Nothing I hadn't dealt with 100 times before, but something about the call bothered me. Anonymous reports always made me nervous, especially ones that came in during the dead of night. In my experience, people who called the police but wouldn't leave their names usually had reasons for wanting to stay invisible. Sometimes those reasons were innocent. They didn't want to get involved, didn't want retaliation from neighbors, didn't want their names in a police report. Sometimes those reasons were more complicated. The Shell station appeared in my headlights like something from a nightmare. The building was a squat rectangular structure with broken windows and graffiti covering every surface. Weeds had grown up through cracks in the concrete, and the old gas pumps stood like skeletal sentries in the pale light of a security lamp that somehow still functioned despite years of neglect. 2 vehicles were parked in the lot, a rusty pickup truck with Tennessee plates and a newer Honda Civic that looked out of place in the abandoned setting. Both cars were dark, no signs of occupants, but their engines were still warm. I could smell the heat radiating from their exhaust pipes as I stepped out of my patrol car. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Even for a rural area at midnight, it was unusually quiet. No insects chirping, no wind through the trees, no distant traffic noise. Just an oppressive stillness that made my footsteps sound unnaturally loud as I approached the building. The front door of the gas station hung open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Broken glass littered the ground around the entrance. and I could see that someone had recently forced entry. The door frame was splintered, and there were fresh tire tracks in the dirt, leading from the parking lot toward the back of the building. "Hello," I called out, my hand resting on the grip of my service weapon. "This is the sheriff's department. Anyone here needs to come out with their hands visible." The echo of my voice seemed to die too quickly, swallowed by whatever darkness lurked inside that abandoned building. I waited for a response, counting seconds in my head, but heard nothing except my own breathing and the steady tick of my patrol car's cooling engine. That's when I noticed the smell. Faint at first, barely detectable under the odors of rust and decay that you'd expect from an abandoned building. But as I moved closer to the entrance, it became stronger. It was organic sweet, and wrong in a way that made my stomach turn and my instincts scream that I should get back in my car and call for backup. But backup was at least 20 minutes away, and whatever was happening here might be over by then. I'd been a cop long enough to know that sometimes you have to make decisions based on incomplete information and live with the consequences. I drew my weapon and stepped through the doorway into the abandoned Shell station. The interior was a maze of shadows and debris. Overturned shelves, scattered merchandise, and broken equipment created obstacles that could hide someone waiting in ambush. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing glimpses of what the place had once been. A typical rural gas station with a small convenience store, soda fountains, and displays for automotive supplies. But someone had been living here. Recently, I could see sleeping bags in what had once been the office area, empty food containers stacked in corners, and the remains of small fires that had been built in metal trash cans for warmth. This wasn't just vandalism or teenage mischief. Someone had turned this abandoned building into a makeshift home. The smell was stronger inside, emanating from somewhere toward the back of the building where the service bays would have been located. It was definitely organic decay, but there was something else mixed in with it. Something chemical that reminded me of the cleaning supplies used in hospital morgues. I followed my nose through a doorway marked "Employees Only" and found myself in what had once been the station's garage. 2 service bays stretched ahead of me, their hydraulic lifts still in place but corroded with years of rust and neglect. Tool benches lined the walls, covered with debris and populated by spiders that scurried away from my flashlight beam. But it was what I found in the second service bay that made my blood run cold. 3 sleeping bags were arranged in a neat line, each one occupied, but the occupants weren't sleeping. They were dead and had been for several days, judging by the state of decomposition. The chemical smell I detected was coming from plastic sheets that someone had used to wrap the bodies, a crude attempt at preservation that had only delayed the inevitable. I keyed my radio immediately, my voice steady despite the horror I was witnessing. Unit 23 to dispatch. I need crime scene units, the coroner, and every available backup officer at my location immediately. We have multiple fatalities at the abandoned Shell station on Highway 41 South. This is now a homicide investigation. The response was immediate. Copy that, Unit 23. Units are en route. Do not disturb the scene. Are you in immediate danger? I looked around the garage, my flashlight beam dancing across the shadows cast by old equipment and debris. The killers could still be here, hiding in the darkness, waiting for me to let my guard down. Unknown, I replied. I'm securing the scene and maintaining position until backup arrives. But as I waited for help to arrive, I began to notice details that suggested this wasn't a typical multiple homicide. The bodies were arranged too carefully, positioned with a precision that spoke of ritual rather than random violence. Personal belongings were stacked neatly beside each sleeping bag, wallets, jewelry, cell phones, all organized like someone was taking inventory, and written on the concrete floor in what looked like dried blood was a message that made my hands shake as I photographed it for evidence. The watchers see all. The taken serve forever. The station feeds the darkness. I'd seen a lot of crime scenes in my career, but nothing like this. This wasn't just murder. This was something else entirely, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about human nature and the kinds of evil that ordinary people were capable of. The first backup units arrived within 20 minutes, followed quickly by crime scene technicians and investigators from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. By dawn, the abandoned Shell station had been transformed into the center of the largest criminal investigation our county had ever seen. But it was just the beginning. Detective Sarah Martinez from the TB, I took charge of the investigation, and her first question cut right to the heart of what made this case so disturbing. Detective Sullivan, in your assessment, how long have these victims been deceased? I looked back at the service bay where crime scene photographers were documenting every detail of the macabre scene. Based on the decomposition and the smell, I'd estimate 3 to 5 days. But someone's been maintaining this site. The sleeping bags are arranged too neatly for this to be where they were killed. Martinez nodded grimly. So we're looking at a body dump, not a murder scene. Someone killed these people elsewhere and brought them here for storage or display. The victims were identified within 48 hours. Rebecca Thompson, 34, a nurse from Cookville who'd been reported missing 6 days earlier. James Morrison, 41, a truck driver from Nashville who disappeared while making a delivery run through our area. And Lisa Chun, 28, a social worker from Knoxville who'd been traveling to visit her parents when she vanished. What connected them wasn't immediately obvious. They lived in different cities, worked different jobs, had different social circles. But as the investigation progressed, a pattern began to emerge that made everyone involved deeply uncomfortable. All 3 victims had stopped for gas at remote stations along Highway 41 during their final days. All 3 had used credit cards at those stops, creating a paper trail that showed their movements. And all 3 had encountered the same person during those stops, a man who worked as a pump attendant at various independent stations along the route. Thomas Whitmore, 45, had been employed at 6 different gas stations over the past 2 years, never staying in one place for more than a few months. He had a clean criminal record, good references from previous employers, and a story about being a drifter who preferred temporary work to permanent employment. But when TBI agents went to interview him at his last known address, they found an apartment that told a very different story. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, showing women at gas stations throughout Middle Tennessee. Some were candid shots taken from a distance, showing unsuspecting customers pumping gas or paying inside station convenience stores. Others were closer, more intimate photos that could only have been taken by someone who was standing nearby when they were shot. Many of the photos showed the same women over multiple visits, suggesting that Whitmore had been stalking specific targets for weeks or months before making his move. The photos were organized chronologically and geographically, creating a visual database of potential victims that covered nearly 200 miles of highway. But most disturbing of all were the photos that showed what appeared to be the victims after they'd been taken. Bound, terrified, pleading with the camera. These weren't just documentation of crimes. They were trophies. Detective Martinez spread the photos across a conference table at the TBI field office, her expression grim as she briefed the task force that had been assembled to handle the case. Thomas Whitmore isn't just a serial killer, she said. He's a predator who's been operating a systematic hunting operation using rural gas stations as his hunting ground. He gets hired at these remote locations, identifies potential victims, stalks them until he understands their routines, then takes them when the opportunity presents itself. Agent Morrison from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit leaned forward to study the photographs more closely. The level of organization here suggests this has been going on for much longer than 6 months. Detective Sullivan, how many missing? Persons cases have you handled in the past 2 years involving people who were last seen at gas stations? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd worked dozens of missing persons cases during my career, and many of them involved people who'd simply vanished while traveling through our area. Truckers who never reached their destinations. Sales representatives who disappeared between client meetings. Travelers who'd been heading home from vacations or visiting family. Most of these cases were written off as people choosing to disappear, walking away from their responsibilities and starting new lives somewhere else. In rural areas, people vanish all the time. Sometimes they're running from debt or domestic problems. Sometimes they're suffering from mental health issues that make them unable to cope with their circumstances. Sometimes they just decide they want a different life and have the freedom to pursue it. But looking at Whitmore's photographs, I realized that some of those missing people might not have chosen to disappear at all. "I'll need to review our files," I told Agent Morrison. "But off the top of my head, I can think of at least a dozen cases where someone was last seen at a gas station and never found." The investigation expanded rapidly. TBI agents and FBI analysts began reviewing missing persons reports from across the Southeast, looking for cases that matched the pattern Whitmore had established. They found connections that spanned multiple states and reached back nearly 5 years. Whitmore had been using a network of employment agencies that specialized in placing temporary workers at gas stations, truck stops, and other roadside businesses. He'd move from location to location, staying long enough to identify and stalk potential victims, then disappearing before anyone connected him to their disappearances. But the network wasn't limited to Tennessee. Similar patterns were found in Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia. Temporary workers who moved between isolated gas stations. Missing persons cases involving travelers who'd last been seen at those stations. And in some areas, abandoned buildings where evidence suggested victims had been held before being moved to final disposal sites. The scope of the investigation became national within 2 weeks. FBI agents from multiple field offices descended on our small town, turning the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department into the headquarters for one of the largest serial killer investigations in recent memory. But Thomas Whitmore himself remained elusive. Despite having his photograph, his fingerprints, and detailed information about his movements, he seemed to have vanished completely. It was as if he'd been absorbed by the same darkness that had claimed his victims. Agent Morrison set up a war room in our department's conference area, covering the walls with maps, photographs, and timeline charts that illustrated the scope of Whitmore's operation. Red pins marked confirmed crime scenes. Yellow pins showed possible related cases. Green pins indicated locations where Whitmore had been employed as a pump attendant. The pattern that emerged was terrifying in its systematic precision. Whitmore selects rural gas stations that meet specific criteria, Morrison explained to the assembled task force. Isolated locations with minimal security systems. Small staffs that work alone during night shifts. Customer bases that include a high percentage of travelers who wouldn't be missed immediately if they disappeared. He pointed to a cluster of pins in eastern Tennessee. He gets hired at these locations using false identification and employment references that check out, because they're connected to legitimate businesses. He works normal shifts, acts like a model employee, builds relationships with his supervisors and co-workers. Morrison moved to another section of the map. But while he's working, he's also conducting surveillance. He identifies customers who fit his victim profile, people traveling alone, people who stop regularly on predictable schedules, people who pay with cash and don't leave credit card trails that might be tracked quickly. The victim profile was disturbingly specific. Whitmore preferred women between the ages of 25 and 45, who traveled alone for work or family reasons. Nurses driving between hospitals for shift work. Sales representatives covering rural territories. women visiting elderly relatives in nursing homes or assisted living facilities. These are people whose absences might not be noticed for days or weeks, Martinez added. People whose work schedules or family obligations create natural explanations for brief disappearances. By the time anyone realizes they're truly missing, Whitmore has had time to move them to secondary locations and establish alibis for himself. But the most disturbing aspect of Whitmore's operation was its mobile nature. He never stayed in one location long enough to arouse suspicion. 3 to 6 months at each gas station, just long enough to identify and take 1 or 2 victims. Then he'd move on to the next location before anyone connected him to the disappearances. We're looking at a 5-year timeline, Morrison said. 47 possible victims across 6 states. And those are just the cases where we found enough evidence to establish connections. The real number could be much higher. The photographs found in Whitmore's apartment told the story of a predator who treated hunting human beings like other people might treat collecting stamps. Each victim was carefully documented from initial surveillance through final disposition. Whitmore had kept detailed records of his victims' routines, their fears, their final words. But there was something else in those photographs that made my skin crawl. In many of the images, especially the ones taken at the abandoned Shell station, there appeared to be other people present. Shadowy figures in the background who seemed to be assisting Whitmore with his activities. "Agent Morrison," I said during one of our briefings, "I think Whitmore might not be working alone." Morrison pulled out a magnifying glass and studied the photographs I'd identified. In image after image, he found evidence of additional perpetrators, extra sets of footprints in dirt, shadows that couldn't be accounted for by known light sources, reflections in vehicle windows that showed people who weren't otherwise visible in the frame. "You're right," Morrison said grimly. "We're not looking for a lone serial killer. We're looking for an organization." The investigation took another dark turn when FBI analysts began examining the financial records associated with Whitmore's various identities. Money had been flowing into accounts connected to his false names, but it wasn't coming from gas station paychecks. Large cash deposits were being made regularly, always in amounts that wouldn't trigger federal reporting requirements. Someone was paying Whitmore for his activities, but who and why? The answer came from an unexpected source: the Internal Revenue Service. investigators working financial crimes had been tracking a money laundering operation that moved cash through rural businesses in the Southeast. Shell companies were being used to purchase abandoned properties, old gas stations, closed restaurants, defunct truck stops, then used those properties as fronts for illegal activities. The abandoned Shell station where we'd found the bodies was owned by one of these companies, Rural Properties Investment, LLC, which was registered in Delaware, but operated through a management firm in Nashville. The management firm was owned by another Shell company, which was owned by yet another Shell company, creating a maze of corporate entities that made it nearly impossible to trace actual ownership. But IRS analysts are patient people who specialize in following money trails through complex corporate structures. After weeks of painstaking investigation, they traced the ownership of Rural Properties Investment LLC back to its source, a human trafficking network that operated across multiple states. "Detective Sullivan," Agent Morrison said when he briefed me on the IRS findings, "what you discovered at that gas station wasn't just a murder scene. It was a storage facility for a human trafficking operation that's been moving victims through rural areas for at least 5 years. The scope of the criminal enterprise was staggering. The trafficking network owned or controlled dozens of abandoned properties throughout the Southeast, using them as temporary holding facilities for victims before moving them to final destinations. Gas stations were particularly valuable because they provided isolation, multiple exit routes, and a legitimate reason for various vehicles to come and go at all hours. Whitmore wasn't a serial killer motivated by psychological compulsion. was an employee of a criminal organization that treated human trafficking like any other business operation. His job was to identify and acquire victims, then deliver them to the network's distribution system, the victims we'd found at the Shell station had apparently been killed because they'd become liabilities. Either they'd been too difficult to control during transport, or they'd seen something that made them dangerous to the organization's security. But that raised an even more disturbing question. If these 3 victims had been killed because they were liabilities, what had happened to all the victims who weren't liabilities? Where were they now? Asterisk, the FBI's investigation into the trafficking network revealed a criminal operation that was far more sophisticated than anything I'd encountered in my career in rural law enforcement. This wasn't a group of amateur criminals operating out of ignorance or desperation. This was a professional organization with resources, connections, and operational security that would have been impressive if it hadn't been used for such evil purposes. Agent Morrison briefed our task force on the network's structure during a long, grim meeting that lasted well into the night. The organization was organized like a legitimate business, with distinct departments handling different aspects of the operation. Acquisition teams like Whitmore's were responsible for identifying and taking victims from rural areas where law enforcement resources were limited and response times were slow. Transportation teams moved victims between holding facilities using a fleet of vehicles that were registered to various shell companies and driven by people with clean criminal records who could pass cursory law enforcement checks. Processing teams managed the holding facilities where victims were prepared for sale. These locations were typically abandoned buildings in rural areas that had been modified with soundproofing, reinforced locks, and surveillance systems. Victims were held at these facilities for weeks or months while buyers were found in logistics. Were arranged. Sales teams interfaced with buyers throughout North America and internationally. The network's clients included organized crime groups that used trafficking victims for forced labor, wealthy individuals who purchased victims for personal use, and other trafficking organizations that resold victims to end users. But most disturbing of all was the existence of disposal teams whose job was to eliminate victims who became too dangerous or difficult to handle. The bodies we'd found at the Shell station were the work of these disposal teams, professionals who were trained to kill efficiently and dispose of evidence in ways that would minimize the risk of discovery. Detective Sullivan, Agent Morrison said as he concluded his briefing, "You didn't just stumble onto a crime scene. You discovered one of the disposal sites for a criminal organization that's been operating across the Southeast for years. The people running this network are professionals who understand law enforcement procedures and have developed countermeasures for every investigative technique we might use." Asterisk, the investigation continued for months, involving hundreds of federal agents and local law enforcement officers from across multiple states. Slowly, painstakingly, investigators began identifying and arresting members of the trafficking network, but Thomas Whitmore remained a ghost. Despite the nationwide manhunt, despite the resources of multiple federal agencies, despite reward offers that eventually reached 6 figures, he seemed to have vanished completely until the night he came looking for me. Asterisk, it was a cold February evening, nearly 4 months after the discovery at the Shell station, when I first realized I was being watched. I'd been working late at the department, reviewing case files and preparing testimony for the trials of network members who'd been arrested. Most of the other officers had gone home, leaving me alone with a stack of photographs and reports that painted a picture of evil I was still struggling to comprehend. The first sign was subtle, the feeling that someone was watching me through the windows of the conference room where I'd been working. It's a sensation that law enforcement officers learn to trust, that prickle at the back of your neck that warns you when you're in someone's crosshairs. I moved to the window and peered out into the parking lot. My patrol car sat under a security light, surrounded by empty spaces and long shadows cast by leafless trees. Everything looked normal, but the feeling persisted. I was gathering my papers to leave when my cell phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. Detective Sullivan. Detective, the voice was soft, polite, and completely cold. You've been asking a lot of questions about things that don't concern you. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The voice belonged to Thomas Whitmore. Where are you? I asked, already moving toward my service weapon. Close enough to watch you through those windows. Far enough away that you can't catch me, even if you call for backup, right? Now, I looked out into the parking lot again, studying every shadow, every possible hiding place. He was out there somewhere, but I couldn't see him. What do you want? Asterisk, I want you to stop looking for answers you won't like when you find them. I want you to accept that some people disappear and some crimes don't get solved. I want you to understand that there are forces in this world that are much bigger than one small-town sheriff's detective. Whitmore paused, and I could hear traffic noise in the background. He was calling from somewhere near a road, probably moving to avoid being traced. But mostly, Detective Sullivan, I want you to know that I could take you anytime I wanted to. You drive the same routes every night. You stop at the same coffee shop every morning. You live alone in that little house on Maple Street with the broken security light and the back door that doesn't lock properly. The description of my house was accurate in every detail, which meant he'd been watching me for weeks, maybe months. Learning my routines just like he'd learned the routines of his victims. You're making a mistake, Whitmore. Every law enforcement agency in the country is looking for you. You can't hide forever. He laughed, a sound that was more chilling than any threat he could have made. Detective, you still don't understand what you're dealing with. You think I'm some crazy individual who kills people for personal reasons. You think catching me will solve your case and bring justice to the victims' families. Another pause, longer this time. Asterisk, but I'm just an employee, Detective Sullivan. I work for people who have resources you can't imagine and connections you can't threaten. People who can make federal investigations disappear, who can ensure that certain evidence never makes it to trial, who can guarantee that troublesome law enforcement officers suffer unfortunate accidents. The line went dead, leaving me alone in the empty department with the knowledge that I'd become a target. But it wasn't just the threat to my personal safety that bothered me. It was Whitmore's claim that he was working for people with the power to interfere with federal investigations. I immediately called Agent Morrison and reported the threatening phone call. Within hours, FBI agents had set up surveillance on my house and arranged for protection details during my daily activities. But the investigation itself took on a new urgency as federal authorities realized they might be dealing with corruption at levels they hadn't previously suspected. The answer came 3 weeks later in the form of an encrypted email sent to Agent Morrison from an anonymous source. The email contained financial records that showed connections between the trafficking network and legitimate businesses throughout the Southeast. But these weren't just shell companies created to launder money. These were established businesses with government contracts, political connections, and relationships with law enforcement agencies across multiple jurisdictions. Construction companies that held contracts for building federal facilities, security, firms that provided services to government agencies, transportation companies that moved federal prisoners between facilities. All of them were owned or controlled by the same criminal organization that had been running the trafficking network. More disturbing still were the personal financial records that showed payments to law enforcement officers, prosecutors, judges, and federal agents across multiple states. The trafficking network hadn't just been evading law enforcement investigation. They'd been buying protection from within the system itself. Detective Sullivan, Morrison said as he briefed me on the latest developments, we're not just investigating a trafficking network anymore. We're investigating a corruption network that has infiltrated law enforcement at multiple levels. The revelation that corrupt law enforcement officials had been protecting the trafficking network explained why Whitmore had been so confident during our phone conversation. It also explained why the investigation had been meeting resistance from some unexpected quarters FBI agents who tried to interview certain witnesses had been told that those witnesses were unavailable or had recanted their previous statements. Evidence that should have been preserved had been destroyed or lost due to administrative errors. Federal prosecutors who'd been preparing cases against network members had been reassigned to other investigations. "How deep does this go?" I asked Morrison. "We don't know yet, but we're implementing new security protocols for this investigation. All communications are being encrypted. All evidence is being stored at secure federal facilities. And all personnel involved in the case are being vetted by internal affairs divisions." Morrison paused and fixed me with a stare that made my blood run cold. "Detective Sullivan, I need you to understand that your life is in danger, not just from Thomas Whitmore, but from people within law enforcement who have a vested interest in making sure this investigation doesn't succeed. Some of those people have badges in federal authority and access to information about witness protection protocols." The next phase of the investigation was unlike anything I'd experienced in my law enforcement career. Instead of working openly with federal agents and sharing information through normal channels, we operated like a resistance cell within our own departments. Communications were conducted through encrypted channels. Meetings were held at secure locations away from government buildings. Evidence was stored in private facilities rather than official repositories. And everyone involved in the investigation was given false identities and cover stories to protect them from surveillance by potentially corrupt colleagues. It was during this phase that we finally began to understand the true scope of what we were fighting. The break in the case came from an unexpected source: Thomas Whitmore himself. 6 weeks after his threatening phone call, he contacted Agent Morrison directly and offered to trade information about the trafficking network in exchange for protection from the people who'd been employing him. The meeting was arranged at a secure FBI facility in Atlanta, with security protocols that would have been appropriate for a terrorism case. Whitmore was brought in under heavy guard, and the interview was conducted in a room that had been swept for electronic surveillance devices. What Whitmore told us during that interview changed everything I thought I understood about organized crime in rural America. "You need to understand," Whitmore said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that what you've uncovered is just one small piece of a much larger operation. The trafficking network isn't run by criminals hiding from law enforcement. It's run by law enforcement." Agent Morrison leaned forward. "Explain." "The people at the top of this organization are federal agents, state police administrators, sheriff's department commanders, and prosecutors from across the Southeast. They're using their positions to identify potential victims, gather intelligence about investigations, and coordinate activities across multiple jurisdictions." Whitmore pulled out a notebook that he'd hidden before his capture and began reading names and badge numbers. "Deputy Chief Rebecca Harrison, Georgia State Police. She's been providing information about missing persons investigations for 3 years. Agent David Chun, FBI Atlanta Field Office. He's been sabotaging federal investigations into trafficking networks. District Attorney Michael Roberts, Rutherford County, Tennessee. He's been ensuring that certain cases never make it to trial." The list went on for nearly 2 hours. Names of law enforcement officers, prosecutors, judges, and federal agents who'd been either actively participating in the trafficking network or taking money to look the other way when evidence of trafficking surfaced. "How do you know all this?" Morrison asked. "Because they recruited me," Whitmore replied. 3 years ago, I was arrested on drug charges in Alabama. Federal agents offered me a deal: work for their trafficking operation and avoid prison, or refuse and spend the next 20 years behind bars. Whitmore described a recruitment process that targeted criminals with specific skills, surveillance, violence, intimidation, and most importantly, the ability to blend in with rural communities. While conducting illegal activities, they don't recruit random criminals, he explained. They look for people who can pass background checks, who can maintain cover stories for months at a time, who can operate in small communities without arousing suspicion. But what made the network so effective wasn't just the criminals they recruited. It was the corrupt law enforcement officers who protected them. Detective Sullivan, do you know why no one arrested me during the 4 months after you found those bodies at the gas station? I didn't answer, but I had a sinking feeling I knew where this was going. Because someone in your department has been feeding information about the investigation to the network. Someone with access to FBI briefings, surveillance plans, and witness protection protocols. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. The idea that someone in my own department might be working for the trafficking network was almost too horrible to consider. Who? Morrison demanded. Whitmore smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. That's what you're going to have to figure out, Agent Morrison. Because until you identify and eliminate the corruption within your own agencies, the network will always be one step ahead of your investigations. Asterisk, the interview continued for hours, with Whitmore providing details about the network's operations that corroborated everything federal investigators had suspected but couldn't prove. Financial records, organizational structures, communication methods, and most importantly, a list of corrupt law enforcement officers who'd been protecting the network's activities, but verifying. Whitmore's claims would require internal investigations. That could take years and might compromise ongoing operations against the network. Meanwhile, victims continued to disappear, and the people responsible remained free to operate with impunity. Agent Morrison made a decision that would define the rest of the investigation. Detective Sullivan, I'm creating a classified task force to investigate law enforcement corruption related to the trafficking network. This task force will operate independently of normal FBI channels, with security clearances that require polygraph examinations and extensive background investigations. Morrison paused and studied my face carefully. I'm offering you a position on this task force, but I need you to understand what you're accepting. You'll be investigating colleagues, supervisors, and possibly friends. You'll have access to information that could destroy careers and send federal agents to prison. And you'll be at risk from people within law enforcement who have killed to protect their involvement in the network. I thought about the 3 victims we'd found in that service bay. Rebecca Thompson, who just wanted to get home after a long shift at the hospital. James Morrison, who'd been trying to make an honest living driving trucks. Lisa Chun, who'd devoted her career to helping troubled families. They died because they'd had the misfortune to cross paths with a predator who was protected by corrupt law enforcement officers. Their families deserved justice, even if getting that justice meant exposing corruption within my own profession. Except, I said. The classified task force operated out of a nondescript office building in Nashville, far from any government facility that might be under surveillance by corrupt law enforcement officers. Our team consisted of 6 investigators, 3 FBI agents who'd been vetted by Internal Affairs, 2 IRS financial crime specialists, and me. Our mission was to identify every corrupt law enforcement officer who'd been protecting the trafficking network and build cases against them that would stand up in federal court. But we had to do it without alerting them to our investigation, which meant operating in complete secrecy while maintaining our normal duties and appearances. The work was painstaking and dangerous. We spent weeks analyzing financial records, tracking communications between suspected corrupt officers and known trafficking network members, and identifying patterns in case dispositions that suggested interference by people within the system. What we found was a web of corruption that extended far beyond what Whitmore had revealed in his initial interview. The trafficking network had been systematically recruiting law enforcement officers for over a decade, using a combination of bribery, blackmail, and threats to build a protective network within multiple agencies. Deputy Chief Rebecca Harrison of the Georgia State Police had been receiving monthly payments of $10,000 in exchange for providing advance warning about federal investigations. Agent David Chen had been sabotaging trafficking cases by ensuring that key evidence was lost or destroyed. District Attorney Michael Roberts had been dismissing charges against network members by claiming insufficient evidence or procedural violations. But the corruption wasn't limited to individual bad actors. Entire departments had been compromised through systematic recruitment of officers at multiple levels. The network would identify departments with limited oversight and inadequate internal affairs capabilities, then gradually recruit personnel until they had effective control over law enforcement activities in those jurisdictions. Sheriff's departments in rural counties were particularly vulnerable because they operated with minimal federal oversight and were heavily dependent on local political support. The network could gain control of these departments by corrupting key officials and then using their influence to protect trafficking operations in those areas. As our investigation progressed, I began to understand why Whitmore had been so confident. During our phone conversation, he wasn't just protected by individual corrupt officers. He was protected by a systematic corruption network that had infiltrated law enforcement at multiple levels. Detective Sullivan, Agent Morrison said during one of our secure briefings, "We've identified at least 47 law enforcement officers across 6 states who appear to be taking money from the trafficking network. But we think that's just the beginning." Morrison pulled out a map showing the locations of confirmed trafficking operations overlaid with the jurisdictions of suspected corrupt officers. "Look at this pattern. Every major trafficking route, every holding facility, every disposal site is located in an area where we've identified corrupt law enforcement officers. This isn't coincidental. The network has been building its infrastructure specifically in areas where they have law enforcement protection." The implications were staggering. The trafficking network hadn't been evading law enforcement investigation. They'd been controlling it from the inside, using corrupt officers to redirect investigations, destroy evidence, and eliminate threats to their operations. But as we dug deeper into the corruption network, we began to realize that law enforcement officers weren't the only officials who'd been compromised. The network had also recruited politicians, judges, prosecutors, and federal agents whose positions gave them the power to protect trafficking operations from investigation and prosecution. "This goes all the way to Washington," Agent Morrison told our task force during a briefing that left everyone in the room shaken. "We've identified payments to congressional staff members, federal judges, and officials in multiple cabinet-level departments." The trafficking network wasn't just a criminal organization. It was a parallel government that operated within legitimate government institutions, using corruption to create a shadow system of law enforcement that served criminal interests rather than public safety. As our investigation into the corruption network progressed, Thomas Whitmore continued to contact me periodically. Sometimes it was phone calls where he'd provide additional information about network operations. Sometimes it was text messages with photographs showing surveillance of my daily activities. Always, there was an underlying threat that I was being watched and could be taken whenever the network decided I'd become too dangerous. But there was something else in Whitmore's communications, something that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with his role in the organization. "Detective Sullivan," he said during one late-night phone call, "do you know what they do to people who try to leave the network? Tell me." "They make them disappear, just like they do with trafficking victims. But first, they make sure that person's law enforcement colleagues understand that cooperation with federal investigations can be hazardous to their health. Whitmore described a system of intimidation and elimination that the network used to maintain control over corrupt law enforcement officers. Officers who threatened to expose the network or cooperate with federal investigations would receive warnings, photographs of their family members, evidence that their homes were being watched, demonstrations of the network's ability to access their personal information. If warnings weren't sufficient, the network would escalate to more direct measures. Corrupt officers who became liabilities would suffer apparent accidents or medical emergencies that couldn't be traced to criminal activity. Their deaths would be attributed to natural causes or random events, but the message to other corrupt officers was clear. Cooperation with federal authorities was a terminal offense. Detective, I'm telling you this because I think you're an honest cop who got caught up in something bigger than you understand. But I'm also telling you because I need your help. My help with what? Getting out. The network is planning to eliminate everyone who knows too much about their operations. That includes me, and it includes some of the corrupt officers who've been working for them. Whitmore explained that the trafficking network was preparing to shut down their operations in the Southeast and relocate to other regions where they hadn't attracted federal attention. As part of this relocation process, they were planning to eliminate all potential witnesses and evidence that could be used against them. They're going to kill me, Detective Sullivan. But before they do, they're going to use me to lure honest law enforcement officers into traps where they can be eliminated as well. I think you're one of their targets. The warning was confirmed 2 days later when Agent Morrison's internal affairs contacts informed him that our classified task force had been compromised. Someone within the FBI had been providing information about our investigation to the trafficking network. Detective Sullivan, you need to go into protective custody immediately, Morrison said during an emergency meeting. We have intelligence that suggests the network is planning to eliminate you within the next 48 hours. But instead of accepting protective custody, I made a decision that probably saved my life and allowed us to finally bring down the corruption network. Agent Morrison, I want to use myself as bait. Morrison's expression showed exactly what he thought of that idea. Detective, these people have killed federal agents. They have resources and connections that we're still trying to understand. Using yourself as bait is suicide. Maybe, but it's also the only way we're going to identify and arrest the corrupt officers who've been protecting them. If they're planning to eliminate me anyway, let's give them an opportunity to try it in a way that allows us to catch them in the act. The plan we developed was risky, but it offered the best chance of exposing the network's law enforcement connections. I would continue my normal activities, but with extensive surveillance and backup that the corrupt officers wouldn't be able to detect. When the network made their move against me, federal agents would be ready to identify and arrest everyone involved. Asterisk, the trap was set for a Friday night in March. I was scheduled to work a routine patrol shift covering the same areas where I'd been investigating trafficking operations. According to intelligence gathered by our task force, the network was planning to eliminate me during a fake emergency call that would lure me to an isolated location where I could be killed without witnesses. What they didn't know was that every move I made that night was being monitored by federal agents, using surveillance equipment that the corrupt officers in our department couldn't access. When the call came in, federal backup would already be in position to respond. The call came at 11:23 p.m. Unit 23, respond to the old Shell station on Highway 41 South. Anonymous caller reports screaming and possible gunshots. Proceed with caution and advise. It was the same location where I'd found the 3 bodies 4 months earlier. The network was bringing everything full circle, using the site of their original crime to eliminate the detective who'd exposed their operations. Unit 23 responding. I replied, following the script that Morrison and I had rehearsed. ETA, approximately 15 minutes. As I drove toward the Shell station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was driving toward my own execution. Despite all the federal surveillance and backup that had been arranged, despite all the precautions that had been taken to ensure my safety, I was still heading into a trap set by people who'd been killing law enforcement officers for years. The abandoned Shell station looked exactly as it had 4 months earlier, a monument to decay and neglect surrounded by darkness and silence. But this time, I knew what to look for. 3 vehicles were parked in the lot. The same rusty pickup truck and Honda Civic that had been there during my original investigation, plus a black SUV with tinted windows that definitely hadn't been there before. The SUV's engine was running, exhaust vapor visible in the cold night air. I parked my patrol car in a position that would allow for a quick escape if necessary and stepped out into the silence. My radio was set to an encrypted channel that would allow me to communicate with federal agents without being monitored by potentially corrupt dispatchers. "This is Detective Sullivan," I said softly. "I'm at the location." 3 vehicles present, including one that wasn't here during the original investigation. "Proceeding to investigate." "Copy that, Detective," Morrison's voice came back through my earpiece. "We have eyes on your location. Federal agents are in position. Proceed as planned." I approached the Shell station with my weapon drawn and my flashlight cutting through the darkness ahead of me. Every shadow could hide an armed assailant. Every sound could be the warning that the trap was about to be sprung. The front door was open, just as it had been during my first visit. But this time, I could see light coming from somewhere in the back of the building. Not electrical light. The station had been without power for years, but the flickering glow of candles or lanterns. "Hello," I called out. "Sheriff's Department. Anyone here needs to identify themselves immediately." A voice answered from somewhere in the darkness ahead of me. "Detective Sullivan, please come in. We've been waiting for you." The voice belonged to someone I recognized, though it took me a moment to place it. When I did, my blood ran cold. It was Deputy Chief Harrison from my own department. *I found Deputy Chief Robert Harrison in what had once been the station's service garage, standing next to the same service bay where I discovered the 3 bodies months earlier. He was wearing civilian clothes rather than his uniform, but there was no mistaking his identity or the fact that he was holding a pistol pointed in my direction. "Chief Harrison," I said, keeping my own weapon trained on him while trying to understand what I was seeing. "What are you doing here?" "Cleaning up a mess that's gotten out of control," Harrison replied, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone he'd always used during department briefings. "Detective Sullivan, you've caused serious problems for a lot of people." 3 other figures stepped out of the shadows around the garage. Thomas Whitmore, a woman I didn't recognize, and a man in a federal agent's windbreaker whose face was hidden by the hood of his jacket. "Detective," Whitmore said, "I tried to warn you. Told you that there were forces bigger than you could handle. But you wouldn't listen." The woman moved closer, and I could see her face clearly in the lamplight. She was middle-aged, professional-looking, with the kind of confident demeanor that suggested she was accustomed to giving orders and having them followed. "Detective Sullivan, my name is Rebecca Martinez. I'm a federal prosecutor with the Justice Department's Organized Crime Division." My confusion must have been obvious, because she continued without waiting for a response. "For the past 2 years, I've been investigating corruption within federal law enforcement agencies, specifically corruption related to human trafficking networks operating in rural areas." Martinez gestured toward Harrison and Whitmore. "Chief, Harrison and Mr. Whitmore have been cooperating with that investigation, providing information about trafficking operations and the law enforcement officers who've been protecting them. What you've stumbled into, Detective Sullivan, is a federal operation that's been years in development. An operation that you've nearly compromised by conducting your own investigation into matters that are classified at the highest levels." I looked back and forth between Martinez, Harrison, and Whitmore, trying to make sense of what they were telling me. Are you saying that Chief Harrison is an undercover federal agent? I'm saying that the situation is more complicated than you understand, Martinez replied. Chief Harrison discovered evidence of corruption within your department 3 years ago. Rather than report it through normal channels that might have been compromised, he contacted federal authorities and agreed to participate in a long-term investigation. Harrison lowered his weapon slightly. Detective Sullivan, every piece of information you've gathered about the trafficking network, every corrupt officer you've identified, every piece of evidence you've collected, it's all been passed to federal investigators through me. But the threatening phone calls from Whitmore were part of the cover story, Whitmore interjected. Detective, I've been working undercover for the FBI for 2 years. My job was to infiltrate the trafficking network and gather evidence about their operations. The phone calls were designed to make you think I was still a threat, while actually providing you with information that would help your investigation. Martinez pulled out a federal identification badge. Detective Sullivan, everything you've experienced over the past 4 months has been part of a carefully orchestrated federal operation. The discovery of bodies at this location, the investigation into the trafficking network, even the threats against your safety, all of it was designed to draw out corrupt officers within your department and identify their connections to the criminal organization. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. Everything I thought I understood about the case, about the threats I'd been facing, about the corruption within law enforcement, was suddenly being redefined by people who claimed to be on the same side I was on. But the corruption, the payments to law enforcement officers, the network of protection, is real, Martinez confirmed. But it doesn't include Chief Harrison or the officers in your department that you've been working with. The corruption is concentrated in federal agencies and state police organizations that have oversight authority over local departments like yours. The federal agent in the windbreaker finally spoke, his voice muffled by the hood that still concealed his face. Detective Sullivan, you've been an unwitting participant in a federal sting operation that's been designed to identify and prosecute corrupt federal agents who've been protecting trafficking networks across the Southeast. He pulled back his hood, revealing the face of Agent Morrison, the FBI investigator who'd been leading the task force I thought I'd been working for. The classified task force you've been part of was real, Detective. But it wasn't investigating corruption within local law enforcement. It was investigating corruption within the FBI itself. Morrison gestured toward Martinez. Federal Prosecutor Martinez has been leading an investigation into federal agents who've been compromised by trafficking networks. The local investigations, including yours, were designed to create situations where corrupt federal agents would expose themselves by attempting to interfere with or sabotage legitimate law enforcement operations. Agent Morrison, I said, my voice barely steady, are you telling me that everything I've experienced, everything I've investigated, has been part of a federal operation that I wasn't told about? I'm telling you that you've been an unwitting asset in an investigation that's identified and will prosecute dozens of corrupt federal agents who've been protecting human trafficking operations across multiple states. Asterisk Martinez stepped forward. Detective Sullivan, the work you've done, the evidence you've gathered, the courage you've shown in continuing your investigation despite threats to your safety, all of it has been instrumental in building cases against corrupt federal agents who might have continued operating undetected for years. But what about the victims? Rebecca Thompson, James Morrison, Lisa Chun. Are you telling me their deaths were part of some federal operation? Harrison's expression became grim. Their deaths were real, Detective. They were murdered by the trafficking network. But their bodies were discovered because we arranged for you to find them. We needed a local law enforcement officer with credibility and integrity to investigate the trafficking network in a way that would draw out corrupt federal agents. We chose you, Detective Sullivan. because your record showed that you were incorruptible. You couldn't be bought, threatened, or intimidated into covering up criminal activity. We knew that if you discovered evidence of trafficking, you'd pursue the investigation regardless of pressure from corrupt officials. The revelation that I'd been manipulated, that my investigation had been orchestrated by federal agents who'd used me as an unknowing asset, should have made me angry. Instead, I felt a strange sense of relief. For months, I'd been carrying the weight of investigating crimes that seemed too large and too sophisticated for a small-town sheriff's detective to handle. I'd been facing threats from criminals who seemed to have resources and connections that dwarfed anything I could bring against them. Now I understood that I hadn't been fighting alone. The investigation had been supported by federal resources all along, and the threats I'd been facing were part of a controlled operation designed to expose corruption rather than genuine attempts to eliminate me. What happens now? I asked. Now? Martinez said, "We arrest the corrupt federal agents who've been exposed by this operation, and we prosecute the trafficking network using the evidence that's been gathered over the past 2 years." Morrison nodded toward the garage entrance. "Detective Sullivan, would you like to watch as we arrest the corrupt FBI agents who've been protecting Thomas Whitmore?" Asterisk. The arrests began at dawn on Saturday morning, with coordinated raids across 6 states. Federal agents who'd been secretly working for the trafficking network were taken into custody at their homes, their offices, and in some cases while they were actively participating in network operations. I watched from the command center that had been set up at the Nashville field office as arrest teams reported their activities over encrypted communications. The scope of the operation was breathtaking. 47 law enforcement officers arrested simultaneously, including FBI agents, state police commanders, sheriff's department officials, and federal prosecutors. But the most satisfying moment came when Agent David Chen, the FBI agent who'd been sabotaging trafficking investigations, was arrested while attempting to destroy evidence at a storage facility outside Atlanta. Chen had been so confident in his protection by corrupt supervisors that he'd continued his criminal activities even as the investigation was closing in on him. "Detective Sullivan," Prosecutor Martinez said as we watched Chen being loaded into a federal transport vehicle, "that man has been responsible for sabotaging trafficking investigations for 3 years. Dozens of victims might have been saved if he hadn't been interfering with legitimate law enforcement operations." The trials that followed were a media sensation that exposed the extent of corruption within federal law enforcement agencies. Defense attorneys argued that their clients had been entrapped by overzealous federal investigators. Prosecutors countered that accepting money to protect human traffickers was a choice that no legitimate law enforcement officer would make under any circumstances. Most of the defendants were convicted and sentenced to lengthy federal prison terms. Several plea bargains provided additional evidence that led to investigations in other regions, revealing similar corruption networks operating across rural America. Thomas Whitmore, whose cooperation had been instrumental in identifying corrupt federal agents, was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole for his role in multiple murders. But his testimony helped prosecutors understand how trafficking networks recruit and control both criminals and law enforcement officers. Chief Harrison returned to his position as head of the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department, but his experience as an undercover federal asset had changed him in ways that became apparent to everyone who worked with him. He'd spent 2 years pretending to be corrupt, building relationships with criminals, and participating in activities that went against everything he'd believed about law enforcement. "Detective Sullivan," he told me during a conversation several months after the trials ended, "I want you to understand something important. The corruption we investigated wasn't an aberration. It's a constant threat that every law enforcement agency faces." Harrison walked to the window of his office, looking out at the rural landscape that had been the hunting ground for trafficking networks for years. Criminal organizations will always try to corrupt law enforcement officers because corrupt officers are the most valuable assets they can acquire. An officer who can be bought or blackmailed is worth more to criminals than any weapon or technology or strategic advantage. But the temptation to accept corruption isn't just about money. It's about the isolation and pressure that law enforcement officers face, especially officers working in rural areas where resources are limited and oversight is minimal. He turned back to face me. "Detective, you were chosen for this operation not just because you're honest, but because you demonstrated the kind of integrity that can't be bought, threatened, or worn down by the pressures of police work." "What do you mean?" "I mean that during your investigation, you were offered opportunities to take shortcuts, to accept easy answers, to stop digging when the investigation became dangerous. You were threatened by criminals who had the power to make good on their threats. But you never wavered in your commitment to finding the truth and seeking justice for the victims." Harrison pulled out a commendation letter from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. "That's why you're receiving the state's highest award for law enforcement excellence, and why you're being offered a position with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. The offer to join the FBI was both an honor and a burden. It meant leaving the rural community where I'd built my career and moving into a world of federal law enforcement that operated on a scale I'd never imagined. But it also meant having the resources and authority to investigate corruption networks that were too sophisticated for local agencies to handle. I accepted the position and spent the next 3 years working corruption cases across the Southeast. The experience taught me that the trafficking network we dismantled in Tennessee wasn't unique. Similar networks were operating in rural areas throughout the country, using the same methods of corruption and intimidation to protect their activities. From law enforcement investigation, * working federal corruption cases gave me a perspective on rural law enforcement that I'd never had as a local officer. From the federal level, you can see patterns that aren't visible when you're working individual cases in individual jurisdictions. The trafficking network we'd investigated in Tennessee was part of a national criminal enterprise that had been operating for over a decade. Rural areas were particularly vulnerable to these networks because local law enforcement agencies often lacked the resources and expertise needed to investigate sophisticated organized crime. But more importantly, rural law enforcement officers were vulnerable to corruption because they worked in isolation, with limited oversight and minimal support from federal agencies. Criminal organizations had learned to exploit this isolation by offering corrupt officers financial incentives that dwarfed their legitimate salaries, and by threatening them with violence if they refused to cooperate. Detective Sullivan, FBI. Director Sarah Chen told me during a briefing about nationwide trafficking investigations, "What you experienced in Tennessee is happening in dozens of other locations across the country. Rural communities are being targeted by organized crime networks that understand how to exploit the vulnerabilities of small-town law enforcement." The solution, according to federal law enforcement leadership, was increased cooperation between local and federal agencies. Rural police departments needed access to federal resources and expertise. Federal agencies needed intelligence about local conditions and criminal activities that only local officers could provide. But implementing that cooperation required overcoming decades of mutual distrust between local and federal law enforcement. Rural officers were skeptical of federal agents who didn't understand local conditions. Federal agents were frustrated with local officers who seemed unwilling to pursue complex investigations. The corruption cases I worked showed me that this mutual distrust was being exploited by criminal organizations that benefited when law enforcement agencies didn't cooperate effectively. Trafficking networks operated across multiple jurisdictions specifically because they knew that local agencies often couldn't or wouldn't coordinate their investigations with federal authorities. 3 years after the Tennessee trafficking network was dismantled, I was offered another assignment that would bring me back to rural law enforcement, but with a federal mandate and federal resources. The FBI was creating regional task forces that would be embedded within local law enforcement. Agencies in rural areas identified as vulnerable to organized crime infiltration. These task forces would work closely with local officers to identify and investigate sophisticated criminal networks while providing federal resources and expertise to local agencies. I was offered command of the Southeast Regional Task Force, with responsibility for coordinating anti-trafficking efforts across 8 states. It was an opportunity to return to rural law enforcement with the resources needed to fight the kinds of sophisticated criminal networks that local agencies couldn't handle alone. But it was also an opportunity to address the root causes that made rural law enforcement vulnerable to corruption in the first place. 5 years after that night at the abandoned Shell station, I found myself back on Highway 41, driving past the location where everything had begun. The building had been demolished as part of a federal property forfeiture case, and the site had been converted into a memorial park dedicated to victims of human trafficking. A small plaque near the entrance read, "In memory of Rebecca Thompson, James Morrison, Lisa Chun, and all victims of human trafficking whose lives were taken by those who should have protected them." I stopped the car and walked to the memorial, thinking about the long journey that had brought me from that terrifying night to my current position as a federal task force commander. The investigation that began with 3 bodies in a service bay had ultimately led to the prosecution of dozens of corrupt law enforcement officers and the dismantling of trafficking networks across multiple states. But most importantly, it had led to systemic changes in how federal and local law enforcement agencies cooperate to investigate organized crime in rural areas. The Southeast Regional Task Force that I now commanded operated out of 12 field offices across 8 states, providing local law enforcement agencies with access to federal resources and expertise. Rural police departments could now request federal assistance for complex investigations without going through the bureaucratic processes that had previously made such cooperation difficult or impossible. The task force had prevented dozens of trafficking operations from establishing themselves in rural areas and had rescued over 200 victims who might otherwise have disappeared without a trace. But perhaps more importantly, the task force had helped local law enforcement agencies identify and resist corruption attempts by criminal organizations. Rural officers now had access to training programs that helped them recognize recruitment attempts by criminal networks and reporting mechanisms that allowed them to seek federal assistance when they were threatened or pressured to participate in illegal activities. The memorial park was quiet in the late afternoon sun, a peaceful place that gave no hint of the horrors that had once occurred there. Families from the surrounding area brought their children to play on equipment that had been installed where gas pumps had once stood. As I stood there, I thought about the lesson that rural law enforcement officers across the country were learning. From cases like the one that had started at this location, rural areas aren't immune to sophisticated organized crime. In fact, they're particularly vulnerable to criminal networks that understand how to exploit isolation, limited resources, and the independence that defines rural law enforcement culture. But rural communities also have strengths that can be used against organized crime: strong social networks, deep knowledge of local conditions, and a commitment to protecting their neighbors that can be more powerful than any law enforcement resource. The key is combining those rural strengths with federal resources and expertise in ways that preserve the independence and local knowledge that make rural law enforcement effective while providing the support needed to fight sophisticated criminal networks. As I drove away from the memorial park that evening, I reflected on how much my understanding of law enforcement had changed since that night at the Shell station. I'd started that investigation as a small-town detective who thought he was dealing with a local crime committed by disturbed individuals. I'd ended it as a federal task force commander who understood that rural law enforcement was on the front lines of a war against organized crime networks that operated across multiple states and countries. Asterisk. My work with the Southeast Regional Task Force has shown me that the trafficking network we dismantled in Tennessee wasn't an isolated case. Similar networks continue to operate in rural areas across the country, constantly evolving their methods to stay ahead of law enforcement investigations. These criminal organizations have learned from the failures of their predecessors. They're using more sophisticated communication systems, more complex financial networks, and more effective methods of corrupting law enforcement officers. They're also expanding their operations beyond traditional trafficking to include drug distribution, weapons trafficking, and cybercrime. But law enforcement has evolved as well. Federal agencies are now working more closely with local departments to identify and investigate organized crime in rural areas. Training programs help local officers recognize the signs of sophisticated criminal networks. Communication systems allow real-time cooperation between agencies that previously operated in isolation. Most importantly, law enforcement agencies are now sharing intelligence about corruption attempts and recruitment efforts by criminal organizations. When a network tries to corrupt an officer in Tennessee, agencies in neighboring states are immediately alerted to watch for similar approaches. The result has been a significant reduction in the effectiveness of organized crime networks operating in rural areas, but the battle is far from over. Detective Sullivan, FBI Director Chun, told me during a recent briefing, these networks are adapting faster than we can counter them. They're using artificial intelligence to identify vulnerable officers and communities. They're exploiting social media to gather intelligence about law enforcement operations. They're even recruiting cybercriminals to attack the communication systems that allow agencies to cooperate effectively. The new generation of trafficking networks represents a threat that goes beyond traditional organized crime. They're using technology and sophisticated intelligence gathering to operate at a scale and level of sophistication that challenges everything law enforcement agencies thought they understood about rural crime. But they've also made a crucial mistake. They've underestimated the determination and integrity of rural law enforcement officers who refuse to be corrupted or intimidated. Officers like Chief Harrison, who spent 2 years undercover to expose corruption within his own profession. Officers like the members of my task force, who've dedicated their careers to protecting rural communities from predators who would exploit their isolation and independence. And officers like you might be someday if you choose a career in law enforcement. Officers who understand that the badge carries both authority and responsibility, that the uniform represents a commitment to justice that can't be bought or sold or compromised without destroying something essential about the relationship between police and the communities they serve. The abandoned Shell station where this story began has been replaced by a memorial park. But the lessons learned from that investigation continue to influence law enforcement operations across rural America. Every rural officer who receives training about organized crime recognition, every federal agent who works closely with local departments, every community that builds effective communication networks, all of them are part of the ongoing effort to protect rural America from sophisticated criminal networks. But the most important lesson from that night at the Shell station isn't about law enforcement tactics or federal cooperation or organized crime investigation. Techniques. It's about the choices that individual officers make when they're confronted with corruption, when they're offered opportunities to look the other way, when they're threatened by criminals who have the power to make good on their threats. Chief Harrison chose to risk his career and his life to expose corruption within law enforcement. Thomas Whitmore, despite his criminal past, chose to cooperate with federal authorities rather than continue participating in trafficking operations. Prosecutor Martinez chose to investigate corruption within her own agency, knowing that it would make her enemies among her colleagues, and I chose to continue an investigation even when it became clear that doing so would put me in danger from both criminals and potentially corrupt law enforcement officers. Those choices made by individual officers in specific situations are what ultimately determine whether law enforcement agencies serve public safety or criminal interests. The trafficking network that operated from that Shell station was dismantled not because of superior federal resources or sophisticated investigation techniques, but because individual officers chose integrity over corruption, justice over convenience, and public service over personal benefit. Asterisk, that choice is still being made every day by law enforcement officers across rural America who face pressure from criminal organizations that want to buy their cooperation or intimidate them into looking the other way. Most of those officers make the right choice. They refuse corruption attempts, report threats to appropriate authorities, and continue doing their jobs with integrity regardless of the personal costs. But some officers make different choices, and those choices create the vulnerabilities that organized crime networks exploit to establish themselves in rural communities. Asterisk. As I conclude this account of the Shell Station investigation and its aftermath, I want to share something that federal investigators learned during the prosecution of the trafficking network members. The criminal organization that operated from that abandoned gas station wasn't unique. It was one node in a larger network of trafficking operations that spans the entire country. And rural areas continue to be targeted by these networks specifically because they offer the combination of isolation and limited law enforcement resources that make trafficking operations profitable. But rural communities aren't helpless against these threats. They have advantages that urban areas lack: strong social networks, deep knowledge of local conditions, and a commitment to protecting their neighbors that can be more effective than any law enforcement resource. The key is recognizing the signs of organized crime infiltration before it becomes established and taking appropriate action to counter it. Signs that a trafficking network might be operating in your area include unusual patterns of missing persons cases, especially involving people who were traveling through the area, abandoned buildings or remote properties that show signs of recent activity despite being officially vacant, employment of temporary workers at gas stations or truck stops who don't seem to fit the local community, reports of suspicious activity at night in areas that are normally deserted. If you're a law enforcement officer and you encounter these signs, the most important thing you can do is report them to federal authorities immediately. Don't try to investigate sophisticated organized crime networks with limited local resources. Don't assume that corruption doesn't exist within your own agency or within federal agencies. And most importantly, don't ignore your instincts when something seems wrong, even if you can't immediately explain why it bothers you. The investigation that began with my response to an anonymous call about suspicious activity at an abandoned gas station ultimately exposed a corruption network that had been operating for years without detection. It was only when a local officer followed his instincts and investigated a scene that seemed wrong that the network's activities were exposed. Rural law enforcement officers are often the first line of defense against organized crime networks that target rural communities. But they can only be effective if they understand the threats they're facing and have access to the resources needed to fight sophisticated criminal organizations. The Southeast Regional Task Force continues to operate across 8 states, providing local law enforcement agencies with federal resources and expertise. But the most important resource we provide isn't technology or funding or specialized training. It's the knowledge that rural law enforcement officers aren't fighting alone against criminal networks that have national and international reach. Federal agencies are committed to supporting local investigations and providing the resources needed to protect rural communities from organized crime. Asterisk, as I write this account, nearly 6 years have passed since that night at the abandoned Shell station. The investigation that followed changed not just my career, but my understanding of the role that law enforcement plays in protecting rural communities from sophisticated criminal networks. I've been thinking about what advice I would give to my younger self, the detective who responded to that anonymous call without understanding what he was walking into. First, trust your instincts. When something feels wrong, it probably is wrong, even if you can't immediately explain why. The smell at that gas station, the too perfect arrangement of evidence, the isolation and silence that seemed unnatural, all of those details were warnings that I was dealing with something more sophisticated than ordinary criminal activity. Second, don't be afraid to ask for help. Rural law enforcement officers are often conditioned to handle situations independently, but sophisticated organized crime requires resources and expertise that no individual officer or small department can provide alone. Federal agencies exist to provide support for local investigations, and they're more willing to help than many rural officers realize. Third, understand that corruption is an ongoing threat that requires constant vigilance. Criminal organizations will always try to recruit law enforcement officers, and they're sophisticated about identifying vulnerabilities and exploiting them. The offer of easy money, the threat of violence against family members, the pressure to compromise just this once for the greater good. These are tools that criminal networks use systematically. Fourth, remember why you became a law enforcement officer in the first place. When you're facing pressure to participate in corruption, when you're threatened by criminals who have the power to make good on their threats, when you're offered opportunities to profit from looking the other way, remember the victims whose safety depends on your integrity. Rebecca Thompson was a nurse who'd spent her career helping sick people heal. James Morrison was a truck driver who took pride in making honest deliveries on schedule. Lisa Chun was a social worker who devoted her life to helping troubled families. They died because criminals had corrupted the system that should have protected them. They died because law enforcement officers chose money over justice, convenience over integrity, personal benefit over public service. But they also died to teach the rest of us a lesson about the cost of corruption and the importance of choosing integrity even when that choice is difficult, dangerous, or professionally damaging. Asterisk, what I haven't told you yet is the most disturbing part of the Shell Station investigation. The part that federal prosecutors decided to keep classified because releasing it would compromise ongoing operations and endanger the lives of undercover agents. The trafficking network we dismantled wasn't just a criminal organization that had corrupted law enforcement officers. It was a law enforcement organization that had become criminal. The network had been started by federal agents who'd been investigating human trafficking cases and had realized that the criminals they were supposed to be arresting were making more money than the agents who were risking their lives to stop them. These agents had decided that instead of fighting trafficking networks, they would take them over and operate them more efficiently. They recruited local law enforcement officers not through bribery or intimidation, but through official channels, convincing them that they were participating in long-term undercover operations designed to infiltrate and destroy criminal organizations. Officers like Chief Harrison had genuinely believed they were working undercover for federal authorities when they began cooperating with the trafficking network. It was only after months or years of participation that they realized they'd been recruited by corrupt agents who were using their law enforcement positions to facilitate rather than prevent human trafficking. Detective Sullivan, prosecutor. Martinez told me during the classified briefing months after the trials ended, the most dangerous criminals aren't the ones who operate outside the system. They're the ones who operate within the system, using legitimate authority to commit crimes. That would be impossible without law enforcement cooperation. The corrupt federal agents who'd been running the trafficking network had used their positions to gather intelligence about potential victims, coordinate operations across multiple jurisdictions, and sabotage investigations that threatened their activities. They'd convinced local officers that they were part of a legitimate federal operation, while actually using them to facilitate kidnapping, torture, and murder. Asterisk, Chief Harrison spent 2 years believing he was working undercover to expose a criminal network, Martinez continued. He was actually being used by corrupt federal agents to help them operate that network more effectively. The psychological impact of learning that he'd been manipulated into participating in the crimes he thought he was investigating had nearly destroyed Harrison. Federal psychologists had worked with him for months to help him understand that he'd been a victim of manipulation rather than a willing participant in criminal activity. But the experience had also given him insights into how corruption spreads within law enforcement agencies and how criminal organizations exploit the trust and loyalty that are essential to effective police work. Detective, Harrison told me during one of our conversations about the case, the most insidious form of corruption isn't officers who knowingly choose to work for criminals. It's officers who are manipulated into believing they're serving justice when they're actually facilitating injustice. Criminal organizations have learned to exploit the idealism and dedication that motivate most law enforcement officers. They convince officers that participating in illegal activities serves a greater good, that breaking small laws prevents larger crimes, that the ends justify whatever means are necessary. Harrison's experience had taught him that corruption prevention required more than just background checks and financial monitoring. It required ongoing education about manipulation techniques used by criminal organizations and support systems that allowed officers to verify the legitimacy of operations they were asked to participate in. Asterisk, the training programs we developed for the Southeast Regional Task Force included extensive modules on corruption recognition and resistance. Officers learned to identify recruitment attempts by criminal organizations, to verify the legitimacy of federal operations through independent channels, and to report suspicious requests from supervisors or federal agents. But most importantly, officers learned that questioning authority wasn't disloyalty when that authority was asking them to participate in activities that seemed wrong or illegal. One aspect of the Shell Station investigation that I rarely discuss publicly is the psychological toll it took on everyone involved. Investigating sophisticated criminal networks that have infiltrated law enforcement agencies creates a level of stress and paranoia that's difficult for outsiders to understand. For months after the investigation began, I found myself questioning every interaction with colleagues, every order from supervisors, every request for information from federal agents. The knowledge that some law enforcement officers were working for criminal organizations made it impossible to trust anyone completely. I developed insomnia, anxiety attacks, and a form of hypervigilance that made it difficult to relax even when I was off duty. Every phone call could be a threat. Every vehicle following my patrol car could be conducting surveillance. Every routine assignment could be a trap designed to isolate me where I could be eliminated. The FBI provided psychological counseling for officers involved in corruption investigations, but the counselors themselves had to be vetted to ensure they weren't compromised by the networks they were supposed to be helping investigate. Detective Sullivan, Dr. Sarah Martinez, the FBI psychologist assigned to our case, explained during one of our sessions, what you're experiencing is normal for officers who've been exposed to systematic corruption within law enforcement agencies. Institution you've devoted your career to serving has been revealed to contain people who are actively working against everything you believe that institution represents. This creates a cognitive dissonance that can be extremely difficult to resolve. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that the psychological impact of corruption investigations extended beyond the individual officers involved. Entire communities could be traumatized by learning that the people they'd trusted to protect them had actually been facilitating crimes against them. Rural communities are particularly vulnerable to this kind of institutional betrayal. Dr. Martinez continued, because they depend on personal relationships and trust networks that can be destroyed when corruption is exposed. The residents of Millbrook County had to come to terms with the fact that some of their law enforcement officers had been protecting criminal networks that were kidnapping and murdering members of their community. Local government officials had to acknowledge that they'd failed to provide adequate oversight of law enforcement agencies that were supposed to be accountable to the public. But perhaps most difficult of all was the realization that the isolation and independence that defined rural life could be exploited by sophisticated criminal networks that understood how to operate in environments with limited law enforcement resources. Asterisk. The Shell Station investigation taught me lessons about law enforcement that weren't covered in any academy training or departmental manual. These lessons have shaped my approach to every case I've worked since then and influenced the training programs I've developed for other officers. First, sophisticated criminal networks aren't limited to urban areas. Rural communities are increasingly targeted by organized crime groups that understand how to exploit isolation, limited resources, and the independence that characterizes rural law enforcement culture. Second, corruption within law enforcement isn't always obvious or dramatic. It often begins with small compromises that seem reasonable at the time, looking the other way for minor infractions, accepting gifts from grateful community members, using department resources for personal benefit. These small compromises create vulnerabilities that criminal organizations can exploit to gradually recruit officers into more serious criminal activities. By the time officers realize they've crossed the line from minor rule bending to serious criminal activity, they're often too deeply implicated to back out safely. Third, the most effective counter to organized crime infiltration is transparency and accountability within law enforcement agencies. When officers know that their activities are being monitored and evaluated by external oversight bodies, when they have secure channels for reporting suspicious activities or corruption attempts, when they understand that their agencies will support them for doing the right thing even when it's difficult, they're much less vulnerable to recruitment by criminal organizations. Fourth, rural law enforcement agencies need federal resources and expertise to investigate sophisticated organized crime, but they also need to maintain their independence and local knowledge. The most effective anti-crime operations combine federal resources with local expertise in ways that preserve the community connections that make rural law enforcement effective. Fifth, individual officers have more power to fight corruption than they often realize. Every officer who refuses a corruption attempt, every officer who reports suspicious activities, every officer who chooses integrity over convenience makes it harder for criminal organizations to operate and easier for honest officers to do their jobs effectively. The Shell Station investigation showed me that the choice between integrity and corruption isn't made once during an officer's career. It's made repeatedly, in small situations and large ones, in moments of crisis and in routine daily activities. Every time an officer chooses to do the right thing despite pressure to do otherwise, they strengthen the institution of law enforcement and make their communities safer. Every time an officer chooses personal benefit over public service, they create vulnerabilities that criminal organizations can exploit. Today, 6 years after the Shell Station investigation began, the threats facing rural law enforcement have evolved but haven't diminished. Criminal networks have learned from the failures of their predecessors and developed new methods for corrupting law enforcement officers and exploiting rural vulnerabilities. Cybercriminals now use social media and data mining to identify vulnerable officers and communities. They gather information about officers' financial situations, family problems, and personal vulnerabilities, then use that information to craft targeted corruption attempts. Drug trafficking organizations have learned to operate like the human trafficking network we dismantled. using temporary workers at legitimate businesses to identify and recruit local law enforcement officers. They offer corruption opportunities that start small and gradually escalate until officers are too deeply involved to withdraw safely. International criminal organizations have discovered that rural American communities offer advantages for money laundering and other financial crimes. They establish legitimate businesses in small towns specifically because local oversight is limited and federal attention is minimal. But perhaps most concerning is the emergence of domestic terrorist organizations that target rural law enforcement officers for recruitment or elimination. These groups understand that controlling or eliminating rural law enforcement is essential to establishing territories where they can operate without interference. The Southeast Regional Task Force now dedicates significant resources to identifying and countering these new threats. We work closely with other federal agencies to share intelligence about emerging criminal networks and to coordinate responses that protect both law enforcement officers and the communities they serve. But the most important defense against these evolving threats remains the same. Individual officers who understand the importance of integrity and have the courage to choose justice over convenience, public service over personal benefit, and truth over corruption. Asterisk, every year on October 23rd, the anniversary of the night I found those bodies at the Shell station, I returned to the memorial park that now occupies that site. It's become a personal tradition, a way of honoring the victims and remembering the lessons their deaths taught me about law enforcement and corruption and the choices that define us as human beings. The park is peaceful now, filled with families and children who have no idea what horrors once occurred there. The playground equipment sits where gas pumps once stood. The walking trails wind through areas where victims were once held captive. The memorial plaque provides the only reminder that this quiet place was once the center of unspeakable evil. But for me, the park represents something else, the possibility of redemption. The transformation of a place where evil flourished into a place where families gather, where children play, where communities come together to remember victims and commit to preventing future tragedies. During my most recent visit, I met an elderly woman who was reading the memorial plaque with tears in her eyes. She introduced herself as Margaret Thompson, Rebecca Thompson's mother. "Officer," she said, "I want to thank you for finding my daughter and bringing the people responsible to justice." I tried to explain that the justice had been incomplete, that some of the people responsible had never been caught, that the criminal network had been larger and more sophisticated than our investigation had been able to fully expose. But Mrs. Thompson stopped me with a gesture. Asterisk, "Officer, my daughter chose to be a nurse because she wanted to help people who were suffering. She spent her life making things better for others, even when it was difficult or dangerous or thankless work." Mrs. Thompson gestured toward the families playing in the park around us. This place where she died has been turned into something that helps people, something that brings joy to families and honors the memory of victims. That's exactly what Rebecca would have wanted. She paused and studied my face carefully. "But I also want you to know that the investigation you conducted, the corruption you exposed, the criminal network you helped dismantle, all of that work continues to protect other families from losing their daughters to predators. Rebecca's death wasn't meaningless if it led to changes that prevent other deaths. Your investigation wasn't a failure if it resulted in reforms that make law enforcement more effective and less vulnerable to corruption." Mrs. Thompson's words stayed with me as I drove home that evening. She was right that the investigation had led to positive changes, better training for rural officers, improved cooperation between local and federal agencies, new oversight mechanisms that made corruption more difficult. But she was also right about something else. The work continues. Criminal networks are still operating in rural areas across the country. Law enforcement officers are still being targeted for recruitment by organized crime groups. Rural communities are still vulnerable to sophisticated criminal networks that understand how to exploit isolation and limited resources. The memorial park where Rebecca Thompson and the other victims are honored isn't just a place of remembrance. It's a reminder that the battle between integrity and corruption, between justice and exploitation, between protection and predation, continues every day in small communities across America. Last month, I was invited to speak at the Tennessee Law Enforcement Academy's graduation ceremony for new officers. Standing before those young men and women who'd just sworn to protect and serve their communities, I thought about what advice I could give them that might prevent them from facing the kinds of situations I'd encountered during the Shell Station investigation. Officers, I began, you're entering a profession that will test your integrity in ways you can't imagine. You'll be offered opportunities to take shortcuts, to accept easy money, to compromise your principles for what will seem like good reasons. I looked out at their faces, seeing my younger self in their expressions of confidence and idealism. You'll be told that everyone does it, that minor rule bending is part of police work, that protecting certain people from embarrassment or prosecution serves the greater good of your community. You'll be threatened by criminals who have the power to make good on their threats. You'll be pressured by supervisors who tell you that your career depends on your willingness to go along with questionable activities. I paused and thought about Rebecca Thompson, James Morrison, and Lisa Chun. When those moments come, and they will come, I want you to remember why you chose this profession. You chose it to protect people who can't protect themselves. You chose it to seek justice for victims of crime. You chose it to serve something larger than your own self-interest. The badge you wear isn't just a piece of metal. It's a symbol of the trust that communities place in law enforcement officers to do the right thing, even when doing the right thing is difficult, dangerous, or professionally damaging. After the ceremony, several new officers approached me with questions about how to recognize corruption attempts and how to resist pressure to participate in questionable activities. Detective Sullivan, one young officer asked, how do you know when you're being recruited by a criminal organization? They don't usually announce themselves as criminals, I replied. They present themselves as people who can help your career, who can provide opportunities for advancement, who can solve problems that normal channels can't address. They appeal to your desire to be effective, to your frustration with bureaucracy, to your loyalty to colleagues and community. They make corruption seem like professionalism and rule-breaking seem like problem-solving. Another officer asked, what do you do if you realize you've been recruited into something illegal? You report it immediately to internal affairs or federal authorities. You document everything you've been asked to do and everyone who asked you to do it. And you accept that your career might be damaged by doing the right thing. But most importantly, you remember that law enforcement is a sacred trust that can't be compromised without destroying something essential about the relationship between police and the communities they serve. The questions continued for nearly an hour, covering topics that ranged from recognizing money laundering operations to identifying human trafficking victims to understanding the legal protections available to officers who report corruption. But the most important question came from a young woman who'd grown up in rural Tennessee and was planning to return to her home county as a sheriff's deputy. Detective Sullivan, how do you maintain hope in law enforcement when you've seen how corrupt the system can become? I thought about that question for a long time before answering. Officer, I maintain hope because I've also seen how resilient the system can be when honest officers choose integrity over corruption. The trafficking network we investigated was dismantled not because of superior federal resources or sophisticated investigation techniques, but because individual officers chose to do the right thing despite personal risks. Chief Harrison chose to risk his career and his life to expose corruption. Thomas Whitmore chose to cooperate with federal authorities rather than continue participating in trafficking operations. Dozens of other officers chose to report corruption attempts rather than accept them. Those choices, made by individual officers in specific situations, are what ultimately determine whether law enforcement serves public safety or criminal interests. I gestured toward the Academy's seal, which depicted scales of justice balanced by a sword and a shield. The institution of law enforcement is only as strong as the individual officers who embody its principles. As long as there are officers who choose integrity over corruption, justice over convenience, and public service over personal benefit, there's hope that law enforcement can continue to serve the communities that depend on it. Asterisk, my work with the Southeast Regional Task Force has revealed that the corruption network we investigated in Tennessee was part of a much larger pattern of organized crime infiltration into rural law enforcement across the entire country. Similar networks have been identified in agricultural areas of California, oil-producing regions of Texas, coal mining communities in West Virginia, and fishing villages in coastal Maine. In each case, criminal organizations have exploited the isolation and limited resources that characterize rural law enforcement to establish operations that would be impossible in urban areas, with greater law enforcement density and oversight. But these networks aren't operating independently. FBI intelligence analysts have identified communication and financial connections between trafficking networks in different regions, suggesting coordination at a national or even international level. Detective Sullivan, FBI Director Chun told me during a recent briefing, "We're dealing with a systematic effort to compromise rural law enforcement across the entire country. This isn't random criminal activity. It's a strategic campaign to create territories where organized crime can operate without effective law enforcement interference." The implications of this realization go far beyond individual trafficking cases or corruption investigations. If criminal organizations succeed in compromising law enforcement in rural areas, they'll have effectively created sanctuaries where they can engage in any illegal activity without fear of prosecution. Drug manufacturing and distribution operations could establish themselves in areas where local law enforcement has been corrupted. Money laundering networks could use rural banks and businesses without fear of federal oversight. Human trafficking operations could move victims through territories where local officers are either corrupted or intimidated into non-interference. The most disturbing possibility is that compromised law enforcement agencies could be used to facilitate terrorist activities or foreign intelligence operations. If criminal organizations can corrupt rural law enforcement officers, so can terrorist groups or hostile foreign governments. The national security implications of law enforcement corruption in rural areas are enormous, Director Chun continued. Rural areas contain critical infrastructure, military installations, and transportation networks that could be vulnerable to attack if local law enforcement is compromised. The response to this threat has required coordination between law enforcement agencies, intelligence services, and national security organizations that had never worked together before. Rural law enforcement corruption is now recognized as a national security issue that requires resources and attention at the highest levels of government. Asterisk. Working corruption investigations for the past 6 years has changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. The knowledge that people within law enforcement can be corrupted, that criminals can infiltrate the institutions we depend on for protection, that evil can hide behind badges and federal authority, all of it has altered my perspective on humanity and institutions and the fragility of the social contracts that hold civilization together. I've seen good officers destroyed by discovering that their supervisors were criminals. I've seen federal agents whose idealism was exploited by corrupt colleagues who convinced them they were serving justice when they were actually facilitating injustice. I've seen entire communities traumatized by learning that the people they'd trusted to protect them had been preying on them. But I've also seen the resilience of law enforcement institutions when corruption is exposed and addressed. I've seen communities come together to rebuild trust in their local agencies. I've seen officers choose integrity over corruption, even when that choice required enormous personal sacrifice. The memorial park that now stands where the Shell station once operated represents both the horror of what can happen when law enforcement fails and the hope of what can be achieved when communities and law enforcement agencies work together to prevent such failures. Every family that visits that park, every child who plays on equipment installed where victims once suffered, every person who reads the memorial plaque and remembers the importance of vigilance against corruption, all of them are part of the ongoing effort to ensure that the lessons learned from those deaths continue to protect future victims. Asterisk. The Shell station case officially closed with the prosecution and conviction of the trafficking network members and corrupt law enforcement officers who'd been protecting them. But the investigation continues in other forms, with other cases, in other jurisdictions where similar networks are attempting to establish themselves. The Southeast Regional Task Force has grown from 6 investigators to over 200, covering operations across 12 states. We've developed partnerships with international law enforcement agencies that are investigating trafficking, networks that operate across national borders. But most importantly, we've developed training and support programs that help rural law enforcement officers recognize and resist corruption attempts by criminal organizations. Detective Sullivan, Agent Morrison told me during our most recent case review, the network we dismantled in Tennessee was just the beginning. We've identified similar operations in over 30 states, all using variations of the same methods that were developed and refined by the people we prosecuted. The new generation of trafficking networks is more sophisticated than their predecessors. They use encrypted communications, cryptocurrency transactions, and artificial intelligence to identify vulnerable officers and communities. They operate across wider geographic areas and maintain lower profiles that make detection more difficult. But they've also revealed vulnerabilities that federal law enforcement is learning to exploit. Their reliance on technology creates digital trails that can be followed by cybercrime investigators. Their need for corrupt law enforcement officers creates recruitment patterns that can be identified by internal affairs investigations. Their operational security requirements create communication patterns that can be monitored by intelligence agencies. We're engaged in an ongoing arms race, Morrison continued. Every time we develop new investigation techniques, they develop new countermeasures. Every time they develop new corruption methods, we develop new prevention programs. But the fundamental vulnerability that allows these networks to operate remains the same: the isolation and limited resources that characterize rural law enforcement. Asterisk, as I prepare to retire from federal law enforcement and return to rural policing, I've been thinking about what the future holds for small communities like Millbrook and the officers who've dedicated their careers to protecting them. The threats facing rural law enforcement will continue to evolve as criminal organizations develop new methods for exploiting isolation and limited resources. Technology will provide both new vulnerabilities for criminals to exploit and new tools for law enforcement to use in fighting them. But the fundamental challenge will remain the same: how to maintain the independence and community connections that make rural law enforcement effective while providing the resources and oversight needed to prevent corruption and investigate sophisticated criminal networks. The solution, I believe, lies in building stronger partnerships between rural communities and federal law enforcement agencies. Not partnerships that compromise local autonomy or impose federal control over local policing, but partnerships that provide rural agencies with access to resources and expertise, while preserving their knowledge of local conditions and their connections to the communities they serve. Rural law enforcement officers need training programs that help them recognize and investigate sophisticated organized crime. They need communication systems that allow real-time cooperation with federal agencies. They need oversight mechanisms that protect them from corruption attempts while preserving their operational independence. But most importantly, they need support from their communities. Rural residents need to understand that their isolation makes them vulnerable to criminal networks that urban communities don't face. They need to participate in crime prevention programs, report suspicious activities, and support their local law enforcement agencies in ways that make corruption more difficult and legitimate policing more effective. Asterisk. Next month, I'll be returning to Tennessee to take over as chief of the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department, replacing Chief Harrison, who's retiring after 30 years of service. It's a homecoming that brings me full circle to where my understanding of law enforcement corruption began. The department I'll be leading is very different from the one I left 6 years ago. Federal oversight and training programs have eliminated the vulnerabilities that criminal networks once exploited. Communication systems now provide real-time connectivity with federal agencies. Oversight mechanisms ensure that corruption attempts are identified and reported immediately. But most importantly, the officers who work for the department understand that their primary loyalty is to the communities they serve rather than to supervisors who might ask them to compromise their integrity. Detective Sullivan, Chief Harrison told me during the transition briefing, the officers you'll be leading have been tested in ways that most law enforcement officers never face. They've seen how corruption can destroy departments and communities. They've chosen to remain honest despite pressure to participate in criminal activities. They understand that wearing a badge is a privilege that can be lost instantly if it's abused or compromised. They know that their effectiveness depends on maintaining the trust of communities that have been traumatized by learning that previous officers had been working for criminal organizations. Harrison paused and looked out the window toward the memorial park where the Shell station had once stood. But they also understand that law enforcement can be redeemed when officers choose integrity over corruption and when communities support agencies that serve public safety rather than criminal interests. The challenges facing the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department are similar to those facing rural law enforcement agencies across the country. Limited resources, vast territories to patrol, sophisticated criminal networks that understand how to exploit rural vulnerabilities, but the department also has advantages that didn't exist 6 years ago. Federal partnerships that provide access to resources and expertise, training programs that help officers recognize and investigate sophisticated criminal networks, and community support systems that make corruption more difficult and legitimate policing more effective. Most importantly, the department has the institutional knowledge that comes from having survived and overcome systematic corruption. The officers understand what corruption looks like, how it spreads, and how it can be prevented through vigilance and accountability. Asterisk. As I conclude this account of the Shell Station investigation and its aftermath, I want to share the most important lesson I learned from that experience and from the years of corruption investigation that followed. The difference between justice and injustice, between protection and predation, between service and exploitation, often comes down to individual choices made by individual people in specific situations where doing the right thing requires courage, integrity, and sacrifice. Thomas Whitmore was a criminal who chose to cooperate with federal authorities rather than continue participating in trafficking operations. Chief Harrison was an honest officer who chose to risk his career and his life to expose corruption within law enforcement. Prosecutor Martinez was a federal official who chose to investigate corruption within her own agency despite the professional risks. Asterisk. Each of these individuals faced moments where they could have chosen personal safety over public service, where they could have looked the other way rather than confronting uncomfortable truths, where they could have accepted corruption as inevitable rather than fighting to preserve institutional integrity. The choices they made determined whether the trafficking network continued to operate with impunity or was exposed and dismantled. Their individual decisions to choose integrity over corruption, justice over convenience, and truth over expedience made the difference between continued suffering for future victims and the protection of rural communities from sophisticated criminal networks. But their choices also came with costs. Harrison spent 2 years living a lie, pretending to be corrupt while actually gathering evidence against criminal networks. Whitmore faced death threats from former criminal associates who considered him a traitor. Martinez endured professional isolation and career damage from investigating corruption within her own agency. I sacrificed my peace of mind, my sense of security, and my faith in institutional integrity. I'll never again be able to look at a badge or a federal identification without wondering whether the person wearing it is genuinely committed to justice or is working for criminal interests. But those costs were worth paying because the alternative, allowing corruption to flourish unchecked, would have been far worse. The trafficking network would have continued operating, claiming more victims like Rebecca Thompson, James Morrison, and Lisa Chun. The corruption would have spread to other departments and other communities, creating territories where criminal organizations could operate without interference. The Shell Station investigation taught me that individual integrity is the foundation of institutional integrity. Law enforcement agencies are only as honest as the individual officers who staff them. Federal oversight is only as effective as the individual agents who conduct it. Community safety depends on individual citizens who are willing to report suspicious activities and support honest law enforcement. None of these institutions can function properly if the individuals within them choose corruption over integrity, personal benefit over public service, or convenience over justice. Asterisk. The abandoned Shell station where this story began has been replaced by a memorial park, but the forces that created the horrors at that location haven't been eliminated. They've evolved, adapted, and relocated to other rural communities where they continue to exploit isolation and limited law enforcement resources. Criminal networks are still recruiting law enforcement officers through bribery, blackmail, and manipulation. Trafficking operations are still targeting rural communities where victims can be taken without immediate detection. Corruption networks are still infiltrating police departments, sheriff's offices, and federal agencies. But law enforcement has evolved as well. Rural officers now have access to federal resources and training that help them recognize and investigate sophisticated criminal networks. Federal agencies now work more closely with local departments to coordinate investigations and share intelligence. Most importantly, law enforcement institutions now have better oversight mechanisms that make corruption more difficult and more likely to be detected before it becomes systemic. The eternal vigilance that protects democracy also protects law enforcement from the corruption that would destroy its effectiveness and legitimacy. Every officer who reports a corruption attempt, every citizen who supports honest law enforcement, every official who chooses transparency over secrecy contributes to that vigilance. But vigilance requires more than just individual virtue. It requires institutional structures that support honest officers and hold corrupt officers accountable. It requires community engagement that provides oversight without micromanagement. It requires federal cooperation that provides resources without federal control. Most importantly, it requires a shared understanding that law enforcement integrity isn't just a professional issue for police officers. It's a community issue that affects everyone who depends on law enforcement for protection. Asterisk. As I write these final words, sitting in my office at the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department, I can see the memorial park through my window. Children are playing on equipment installed where a gas station once stood. Families are walking trails that wind through areas where victims were once held captive. The transformation of that place from a site of horror to a place of healing represents everything I've learned about the possibility of redemption through integrity and the power of communities to overcome evil when they work together with honest law enforcement. But it also serves as a reminder that evil hasn't been eliminated, only contained temporarily. Criminal networks continue to operate in rural areas across the country, constantly developing new methods for exploiting the vulnerabilities that define rural life. The battle between integrity and corruption, between justice and exploitation, between protection and predation, continues every day in small communities where individual officers make choices that determine whether law enforcement serves public safety or criminal interests. Rebecca Thompson, James Morrison, and Lisa Chun died because criminals had corrupted the system that should have protected them. But their deaths also led to changes that have protected hundreds of other potential victims from similar fates. Shell Station investigation began with an anonymous call about suspicious activity at an abandoned building. It ended with the prosecution of dozens of corrupt law enforcement officers and the dismantling of trafficking networks across multiple states. But most importantly, it demonstrated that individual integrity can triumph over systematic corruption. When officers choose to do the right thing regardless of personal costs, that lesson continues to guide my work as I return to rural law enforcement with federal resources and the knowledge gained from investigating the darkest aspects of corruption. Within law enforcement institutions, the threats facing rural communities are real and evolving. But so are the resources available to fight those threats and the determination of law enforcement officers who refuse to be corrupted, intimidated, or manipulated by criminal organizations. The memorial park outside my window stands as proof that places can be redeemed, that institutions can be reformed, and that the choice between good and evil ultimately rests with individuals who decide what kind of legacy they want to leave. Every rural law enforcement officer who makes that choice correctly, every community that supports honest law enforcement, every citizen who reports suspicious activity contributes to the ongoing effort to ensure that the horrors discovered at that Shell Station are never repeated. The investigation continues, the vigilance continues, and the hope for justice, integrity, and redemption continues as well. As long as there are officers willing to do the right thing despite personal risks, as long as there are communities willing to support honest law enforcement despite the difficulties involved, as long as there are citizens willing to remain vigilant against corruption and exploitation, there is hope that rural America can remain a place where people can live safely and independently. That hope is what brought me back to Millbrook County. That hope is what motivates my work training other officers to recognize and resist corruption. And that hope is what I carry with me every time I drive past the memorial park that now stands where evil once flourished. The Shell Station is gone, but the lessons learned from that investigation continue to protect rural communities across America. The battle against corruption and organized crime continues, but so does the commitment of law enforcement officers who understand that integrity isn't just a professional requirement, it's the foundation of justice itself. Asterisk. This story ends here. But the larger story it represents continues every day in rural communities across America, where law enforcement officers face choices between integrity and corruption, where criminal networks attempt to exploit isolation and limited resources, where communities must decide whether to trust or question the institutions that are supposed to protect them. The next chapter of that story will be written by officers who are currently working night shifts in isolated areas, responding to calls that might lead them into situations they're not prepared to handle, making decisions that will determine whether they become part of the solution or part of the problem. It will be written by communities that must balance independence with security, isolation with connection, local autonomy with federal cooperation, and it will be written by citizens who must remain vigilant against corruption while supporting honest law enforcement, who must report suspicious activities while preserving the privacy and independence that make rural life valuable. The memorial park where the Shell Station once stood serves as a reminder that evil can be overcome by good, that corruption can be exposed by integrity, and that the darkest places can be transformed into sources of light and hope. But it also serves as a warning that the price of freedom and safety is eternal vigilance against the forces that would exploit our vulnerabilities and compromise our institutions. The investigation that began with 3 bodies in a service bay ultimately revealed systematic corruption that extended across multiple states and reached into the highest levels of law enforcement. But it also revealed the power of individual integrity to expose and counter that corruption. As you listen to this story in the darkness of your own night, wherever you are, whatever time it is, remember that the choice between good and evil, between integrity and corruption, between justice and exploitation, is made not by institutions or organizations or systems, but by individual people in specific moments when doing the right thing requires courage. The Shell Station investigation taught me that individual choices have consequences that extend far beyond the people who make them. The choice to investigate suspicious activity despite personal risks, the choice to report corruption despite professional costs, the choice to preserve evidence despite threats of retaliation. These individual decisions ultimately determine whether communities are protected or exploited by the people who are supposed to serve them. And so this story ends not with a resolution, but with a challenge. The next time you encounter suspicious activity, the next time you witness potential corruption, the next time you're asked to look the other way when someone in authority is doing something wrong, remember that your choice in that moment might determine whether other people live or die, whether justice is served or perverted, whether your community is protected or exploited. The investigation continues. The choice is yours. And in the darkness of rural America, where isolation can be both sanctuary and trap, where independence can be both strength and vulnerability, where trust can be both essential and dangerous, law enforcement officers continue their vigil against forces that would exploit the very qualities that make rural life valuable. The Shell Station may be gone, but the lessons learned from that investigation live on in every rural officer who chooses integrity over corruption, every community that supports honest law enforcement, and every citizen who remains vigilant against the forces that would turn our institutions against us. As the night deepens around you, as you listen to this story in whatever quiet corner of the world you call home, remember that the darkness holds both dangers and protectors. The choice between becoming one or the other rests with each of us, in moments both large and small, when we decide what kind of legacy we want to leave. The investigation that began at an abandoned gas station taught me that evil is real, sophisticated, and patient. But it also taught me that good is stronger when it chooses to be, that integrity can triumph over corruption when people have the courage to pay its price, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, is never truly defeated as long as there are individuals willing to fight for it. The Memorial Park stands as proof that the darkest places can be transformed into sources of light. The prosecutions stand as proof that the most powerful corruption networks can be dismantled by individual integrity. And the ongoing investigations stand as proof that the battle for justice never ends. But neither does the possibility of victory. In rural America, where distances are measured in trust and safety, depends on the integrity of neighbors you may never meet. Law enforcement officers carry the weight of protecting not just individual citizens, but the way of life that makes rural communities possible. That weight is heavy, but it's carried willingly by officers who understand that wearing a badge means accepting responsibility for more than just enforcing laws. It means protecting the social contract that allows people to live together in peace, the trust that makes communities possible, and the justice that gives meaning to sacrifice. The Shell Station investigation changed my life, but it also changed my understanding of what it means to be a law enforcement officer in rural America. It taught me that individual choices have consequences that extend far beyond the people who make them, that corruption is a cancer that spreads unless it's aggressively treated, And that integrity isn't just a personal virtue, but a professional necessity that determines whether law enforcement serves justice or facilitates injustice. As you drift off to sleep, carried by these words into whatever dreams await you, remember that somewhere in the darkness, rural law enforcement officers are beginning their night shifts, responding to calls that might lead them into situations that will test their integrity, making choices that will determine whether their communities are protected or exploited. Some of those officers will choose integrity despite personal costs. Some will choose corruption despite professional risks. And those choices, made in small towns and rural counties across America, will determine whether law enforcement continues to serve justice or becomes another tool of exploitation. The choice is always individual. The consequences are always collective. And the vigilance required to preserve justice is always eternal. Sleep well. But remember that the price of peace is the willingness of good people to fight for it when fighting is necessary, to choose integrity when corruption would be easier, and to serve justice even when justice demands sacrifice. The investigation continues. The memorial stands. And somewhere in rural America, honest officers are keeping watch against the darkness that would consume us all if we let it. This is Detective Marcus Sullivan, signing off from the memorial park where evil once flourished and hope now grows. The night is dark, but the dawn always comes to those who wait for it with integrity intact and justice in their hearts. Sweet dreams. And remember, the watchers see all, but some watchers serve the light rather than the darkness. Make sure you're one of them. 5 years have passed since I wrote those words. 5 years since I thought the Shell Station investigation was finally behind me. But some stories refuse to stay buried, especially when they involve networks of corruption that span decades and reach into places you never imagined they could touch. I was sitting in my office at the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department on a rainy Thursday morning in November when Agent Sarah Martinez walked through my door without knocking. It was the same Martinez who'd been the federal prosecutor during the original investigation, but she was no longer with the Justice Department. "Detective Sullivan," she said, closing the door behind her and taking a seat across from my desk without being invited. "We need to talk." There was something in her expression that made my coffee taste bitter. In the 5 years since the trials ended, Martinez had left federal service and started a private security consulting firm that specialized in investigating corporate corruption. She looked older, more tired, and there was a haunted quality in her eyes that I recognized from my own mirror. "Agent Martinez," I replied, though I knew she no longer held that title. "What brings you to Millbrook County?" She pulled out a manila envelope and slid it across my desk. "The Shell Station case isn't over, Detective. It never was." Inside the envelope were photographs that made my hands shake as I examined them. Crime scene photos from locations across the Southeast, all showing the same distinctive pattern we'd found at the original Shell Station. Bodies arranged in precise formations, personal belongings organized like inventory, messages written in what appeared to be dried blood. "These are all from the past 2 years," Martinez said quietly. 12 different locations across 7 states. The same signature, the same methodology, the same level of organization. I looked up from the photographs, feeling the familiar chill that always preceded bad news. But we arrested everyone involved in the network. Whitmore, Harrison's contacts, the corrupt federal agents. "We arrested the people we could identify," Martinez corrected. "But the network was larger than we understood, and it had deeper roots than our investigation revealed." She pulled out a second set of documents, financial records, communication intercepts, and surveillance photographs that showed people I didn't recognize conducting activities that looked disturbingly familiar. "Detective Sullivan, what we dismantled in Tennessee was one operational cell of a much larger criminal enterprise. The trafficking network we thought we'd destroyed was actually just one branch of an organization that's been operating for decades." Martinez leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "And they know that you're the one who exposed their Tennessee operations." The implication hung in the air between us like a loaded weapon. After 5 years of relative peace, of believing that the nightmare was over and that justice had been served, I was being told that the people I'd helped put in prison had been working for an organization that was still active, still dangerous, and still interested in settling scores with the law enforcement officers who'd interfered with their operations. "What kind of organization are we talking about?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to hear the answer. Martinez spread out a map of the United States that was covered with colored pins. Red pins marked confirmed trafficking operations, yellow pins showed suspected activities, and green pins indicated law enforcement agencies that had been compromised by corruption. "Detective, what you uncovered in Tennessee was part of the largest human trafficking network in North American history. An organization that's been operating since the 1980s, using rural areas as hunting grounds and urban centers as distribution points." She pointed to clusters of pins across the map. "They call themselves the Harvest Network, and they operate like a legitimate corporation with regional divisions, specialized departments, and a management structure that insulates leadership from operational activities." The scope of what Martinez was describing dwarfed anything I'd imagined during the original investigation. Instead of a regional trafficking network that had corrupted local law enforcement, we were looking at a national criminal enterprise that had systematically infiltrated law enforcement agencies across multiple states. "But that's not the worst part," Martinez continued. "The worst part is that the Harvest Network isn't just engaged in human trafficking. They're involved in drug distribution, weapons trafficking, money laundering, political corruption, and contract killing." She pulled out another photograph that made my blood run cold. It showed Thomas Whitmore, the man who'd supposedly been serving a life sentence in federal prison for his role in the trafficking operations, walking freely through what appeared to be a small-town main street. Whitmore was released 6 months ago, Martinez said. Officially, his conviction was overturned on appeal due to prosecutorial misconduct. Unofficially, the Harvest Network has enough influence within the federal judicial system to engineer the release of key personnel when they need them. The photograph was time-stamped 3 weeks ago, which meant that Whitmore had been free for months without my knowledge. The man who'd threatened me, who'd participated in multiple murders, who'd helped coordinate the trafficking operations that had claimed Rebecca Thompson, James Morrison, and Lisa Chun, was walking around free while I'd been assuming he was safely locked away in federal prison. Detective Sullivan, Thomas Whitmore isn't the only convicted member of the trafficking network who's been released on appeal. Over the past 2 years, 17 people we thought we'd put away for life have been freed by federal judges who found technical problems with their prosecutions. Martinez showed me a list of names that included several corrupt law enforcement officers who'd been central to the network's operations. People I'd testified against. People whose convictions I'd assumed were final. People who had every reason to want revenge against the rural sheriff's detective who'd started the investigation that exposed their activities. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Because the Harvest Network is planning something big. Something that requires eliminating the law enforcement officers who pose the greatest threat to their operations. And detective, based on the intelligence we've gathered, you're at the top of their elimination list." Martinez pulled out one final document, a surveillance report that detailed my daily routines, my family relationships, my home, security measures, and my vulnerabilities. It was compiled with the same professional precision that law enforcement agencies used when planning operations against high-value targets. "They've been watching you for months, detective. Learning your patterns, identifying opportunities, planning the best way to eliminate you without drawing attention to their activities." I studied the surveillance report, noting details about my life that I'd assumed were private and secure. They knew about my morning coffee routine, my weekend visits to the memorial park, even my occasional phone calls with former colleagues from the federal task force. "How did you get this intelligence?" I asked, from a source within the Harvest. "Network who wants out," Martinez replied. "Someone who's been feeding information to my security firm in exchange for protection and relocation assistance." She paused and studied my face carefully. "Detective Sullivan, I'm here to offer you a choice. You can accept federal witness protection and disappear into a new identity, leaving the Harvest Network investigation to other people. Or you can help us use their plan to eliminate you as an opportunity to expose and dismantle their operations, once and for all." The choice Martinez was offering wasn't really a choice at all. I could run and hide, spending the rest of my life looking over my shoulder and wondering when the Harvest Network would finally track me down. Or I could fight back, using myself as bait to draw out an organization that had been responsible for untold suffering and corruption. "What kind of plan are you talking about?" I asked. "The kind that requires you to pretend to be vulnerable while actually being protected by a federal task force that the Harvest Network doesn't know exists," Martinez replied. "The kind that uses their attempt to eliminate you as an opportunity to identify and arrest their operational leadership." She pulled out a thick briefing document marked classified in red letters. "Detective Sullivan, what I'm about to show you is the result of a 2-year federal investigation into the Harvest Network that's been conducted in complete secrecy by agencies that specialize in combating organized crime." The briefing document contained intelligence that was both fascinating and terrifying. The Harvest Network operated like a shadow government within legitimate government institutions, using corruption to create parallel systems of law enforcement that served criminal interests rather than public safety. They had recruited personnel within the FBI, the U.S. Marshal Service, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and dozens of state and local law enforcement agencies. These corrupted officers provided intelligence about investigations, sabotaged prosecutions, and facilitated criminal activities that generated hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue. But most disturbing was their recruitment process. The Harvest Network didn't just offer bribes to corrupt law enforcement officers. They identified officers with financial problems, family difficulties, or career frustrations, then gradually drew them into criminal activities through a combination of assistance, manipulation, and eventually coercion. "Detective Sullivan," Martinez said as I studied the briefing materials, "the corruption you exposed in Tennessee wasn't an aberration. It was a systematic recruitment program that the Harvest Network has been using to build a shadow law enforcement system across the entire country." The scope of the organization was staggering. They controlled trafficking routes that spanned from Mexico to Canada, operated money laundering networks that moved billions of dollars through legitimate businesses, and maintained assassination capabilities that could eliminate threats anywhere in the world. "But they have a vulnerability," Martinez continued. "Their operational security depends on eliminating law enforcement officers who pose threats to their activities. When they target someone for assassination, they have to expose their personnel and methods in ways that can be exploited by investigators who know what to look for." The plan Martinez outlined was both elegant and dangerous. I would continue my normal activities while being protected by a federal surveillance team that would document the Harvest Network's assassination attempt. When they made their move, federal agents would be ready to identify and arrest everyone involved in the operation. "Detective, we'll only get one chance at this. If the operation fails, if they succeed in eliminating you, or if they detect the federal surveillance, the Harvest Network will adapt their methods and become much more difficult to investigate in the future." I thought about Rebecca Thompson, James Morrison, and Lisa Chun, 3 innocent people who died because they'd encountered a criminal network that was protected by corrupt law enforcement officers. Their deaths had led to prosecutions that I believed would prevent similar tragedies. But now I was learning that their killers were free and the network was still operating. What do you need me to do? I asked. Martinez smiled for the first time since she'd entered my office. We need you to be yourself, Detective Sullivan. Continue your normal activities, maintain your routines, and trust that federal agents will be protecting you even when you can't see them. She stood up and walked to the window overlooking Memorial Park where the Shell station had once stood. The Harvest Network thinks they're targeting a small-town sheriff's detective who got lucky during one investigation. They don't realize they're walking into a trap set by federal agencies that have been planning this operation for 2 years. Martinez turned back to face me. Detective Sullivan, this is your opportunity to finish what you started at that gas station 5 years ago, to ensure that the people responsible for those deaths and hundreds of others finally face justice that can't be overturned on appeal or circumvented through corruption. I looked out the window at families walking through the Memorial Park, children playing on equipment installed where victims had once suffered, people living peaceful lives because they believed that law enforcement would protect them from the kinds of predators who saw human beings as merchandise to be bought and sold. When do we start? I asked. We already have, Martinez replied. Federal surveillance teams have been monitoring your activities for the past week, documenting the Harvest Network's reconnaissance activities and preparing for their assassination attempt. She handed me a small device that looked like a standard police radio. This is an encrypted communication system that will allow you to contact the surveillance team if you detect any immediate threats. But Detective, the most important thing you can do is continue living your life normally. Don't change your routines. Don't take extra security precautions. Don't do anything that might alert the Harvest Network that you know they're planning to eliminate you. Martinez gathered her documents and prepared to leave. Detective Sullivan, in 48 hours, the Harvest Network is going to attempt to kill you in a way that will look like an accident or random crime. When they do, federal agents will be ready to arrest everyone involved and use their testimony to dismantle the largest criminal network in American history. She paused at the door and looked back at me one final time. The Memorial Park outside your window exists because you had the courage to investigate suspicious activity at an abandoned gas station 5 years ago. In 2 days, you'll have the opportunity to ensure that Memorial represents the end of the Harvest Network rather than just the beginning of a longer, more sophisticated criminal enterprise. After Martinez left, I sat alone in my office, looking out at the Memorial Park and thinking about the choices that had brought me to this moment. 5 years ago, I'd responded to an anonymous call about suspicious activity and stumbled into an investigation that had changed my understanding of law, enforcement, corruption, and organized crime. Now, I was being asked to use myself as bait to draw out the people who'd been orchestrating that corruption, to trust that federal agents I couldn't see would protect me from assassins who'd been planning my death for months, to risk everything on the chance that this time, justice would prevail over the corruption that had allowed so much evil to flourish. I thought about Thomas Whitmore, walking free after having his conviction overturned through the influence of corrupt federal judges. I thought about the 17 other convicted trafficking network members who'd been released on technical appeals. I thought about the new victims who died in the 12 crime scenes Martinez had shown me, people who'd been killed by a network that was supposed to have been dismantled years ago. But most of all, I thought about Rebecca Thompson, James Morrison, and Lisa Chun, 3 people who died because they'd encountered evil that was protected by corruption within law enforcement. 3 people whose deaths had meaning only if they led to changes that prevented similar tragedies in the future. Picked up the encrypted radio Martinez had given me and keyed the microphone. This is Detective Marcus Sullivan, Millbrook County Sheriff's Department. I'm ready to proceed with the operation. The response came immediately. Copy that, Detective Sullivan. Federal surveillance teams are in position. Maintain normal activities and trust that you're being protected. I turned off the radio and looked out the window one more time at the memorial park where evil had once flourished and hope now grew. In 48 hours, I would learn whether that hope was justified or whether the forces of corruption were stronger than the institutions designed to counter them. But for now, I had work to do. There were patrol shifts to complete, reports to file, and the normal activities of a small-town sheriff's detective to maintain. Activities that would hopefully draw out the people who'd been planning my death and give federal agents the opportunity to end a harvest. Network's reign of terror once and for all. The investigation that had begun with 3 bodies in a service bay was about to reach its final chapter. Whether that chapter ended with justice or tragedy would be determined by the choices made by federal agents I'd never met, by the effectiveness of surveillance systems I couldn't see, and by my own courage in the face of an assassination attempt I knew was coming but couldn't predict. I gathered my patrol equipment and prepared to leave the office for what might be my final shift as a law enforcement officer. Outside, families continued to enjoy the peaceful memorial park, unaware that the man who'd helped create that peace was about to risk everything to preserve it. The next 48 hours would determine whether the Shell Station investigation had truly ended 5 years ago, or whether it had just been the opening chapter of a much larger story about the eternal struggle between justice and corruption, between protection and predation, between the light that honors the dead and the darkness that would consume the living. As I walked to my patrol car, I noticed a black SUV with tinted windows parked across the street from the memorial park. It hadn't been there when Martinez arrived, and something about its positioning suggested surveillance rather than casual presence. Were those federal agents protecting me, or Harvest Network operatives preparing to eliminate me? In 48 hours, I would have my answer. But until then, I had a job to do, a community to protect, and a promise to keep to 3 people who died because corruption had made their killers untouchable. The Shell Station was gone, but its legacy lived on in every choice made by law enforcement officers who understood that integrity wasn't just a professional requirement. It was the difference between justice and injustice, between protection and predation, between honor and corruption. Started the patrol car and began my shift, knowing it might be my last, but determined to make it count in the ongoing battle between good and evil that defines not just law enforcement, but the very nature of civilization itself. The investigation continues. The memorial stands. And somewhere in the darkness, both protectors and predators prepare for the final confrontation that will determine whether justice or corruption ultimately prevails. This is Detective Marcus Sullivan, signing off from Millbrook County, Tennessee, where the night is dark, but the dawn always comes to those who have the courage to wait for it with their integrity intact.